A large white bird, sitting on the hilt of a sword stuck into the ground, beheld many defeated warriors and monsters. Suddenly, something caught the bird's attention, and it quickly turned its head. In front of her, she saw a single person standing in the middle of the battlefield. By this time, the swordsman noticed a horde of massive orcs approaching. Over the centuries, countless different disasters have occurred. The blade in the hands of people has survived a huge number of merciless wars. But these difficult times also produced a great many heroes. And the hero's unusual blade was always at the very center of all events. The name of this blade is Gruhorn, or otherwise known as the Sword of the Heroes of Humanity. Looking forward, the blonde saw a huge number of enemies appearing in front of him. The orc, who had come close to the swordsman, raised his bloody axe for a chopping blow. Then the largest of these monsters used an unknown power to cover the entire crowd with his aura. At one time, the blonde, without being afraid, simply held out his blade in front of himself, intending to accept another fight, after which a blue aura covered a huge part of the area around the warrior. During the interaction, the warriors who had recently been lying dead began to rise. Only the echo of the battle horn announces the attack at sunrise. The assembled warriors were only too happy to begin a fierce battle against the monsters. Before the start of a large-scale war, the season of the year, the poem of winter, began to play in our souls. Ancient heroes, now forgotten, were once friends of this majestic blade. But now Gruhorn, with his own strength, killed every enemy in his path. But besides the fair-haired swordsman, there were other warriors who possessed mighty strength. Warriors who are ready to do anything to achieve victory against bloodthirsty monsters. Life as the hope of humanity, as a living legend for each of them, began with Gruhorn. At one time, the world again plunged into chaos, and a new era of disasters began. The same thug, approaching the blonde, intended to finish him off. At one time, the blonde also had no intention of giving in to the opponent opposite him. It only took him a moment to split the orc's massive body in two. This swordsman is the main character, who was once the Blade of Heroes. Now Gruhorn intended to once again become living legends among all mankind. Having returned to the past, the majestic Sword of Heroes managed to transform into a weapon. And over the long centuries, it met different owners and turned them into heroes whose names went down in history. And then Gruhorn met his new owner, who became his close friend. It was a boy from a nameless village, Leonberg, which did not stand out among other villages. Subsequently, these two began to wander around the world, exterminating all kinds of monsters. Gruhorn and his close friend performed feats that no one could repeat. In the midst of achieving one of the feats, an explosion thundered, audible throughout the entire area, after which a wounded swordsman appeared, holding the blade with both hands. This time, the opponent of this duo was a huge black dragon. Having reduced the distance with his opponent, the winged one began to gather energy for a powerful surge. In response, the blonde man holding out his sword released his energy, the power of which was enough to disperse the dragon's powerful energy. Following this, the same swordsman suggested to his friend to go only forward. Thus, after these words, the swordsman rushed forward with Gruhorn at the ready. In a mere moment, the blonde man raised the Sword of Heroes and found himself above the black dragon. Then a multitude of cutting blows struck the entire body of the monster, giving it no chance of survival. And when the duo defeated the dragon, Gruhorn's friend managed to become the ruler of an entire state. As for the Sword of Heroes, it, along with the legend of slaying dragons, was passed down to the descendants of his friend. The swordsman, addressing his weapon as a friend, asked it to look after the kingdom. After a long time of pitch silence, Grunhorn woke up from the noise. Feeling the strong shaking, the blade could not understand what impudent person dared to shake it. At one time, the fat man, spitting, declared that from that moment on he would become the master of the blade. The knights surrounding the blonde reminded the young master that touching this relic was forbidden. Trying to comprehend what was happening, Gruhorn assumed that he was in the hands of the fat prince. The blonde ordered his subordinates to shut up, because there was nothing in this country that he was not allowed to touch. Realizing that his guess was correct, the Sword of Heroes was displeased and amazed. Without wasting any time, he decided to test the insolent man who dared to take him with his authority. It turned out to be Indrian Leonberg, a man who is a descendant of the Holy Sword, returning to which he noted under his breath how he could no longer be ignored. Hearing these words, Gruhorn, calling the prince a nonsense, thought how he was talking complete nonsense. Raising the blade above himself, the young prince desired the power of the great dragon slayer. Shouting the name of the sword Gruhorn, the fat man began to wave it furiously, not intending to let anyone get close to him. Unexpectedly, Indrian Leonberg rushed forward, determined to punish the ignoramuses who wanted to take the relic from him. But then, to the surprise of everyone present, the prince's fat body lost its balance, because of which the sharp blade headed straight towards the frightened Indrian Leonberg. The guards, aware of everything that was happening, rushed to the master, wanting to save him. But it was already too late, because the long tip of the Sword of Heroes passed right through the blonde's chest. Grunhorn himself could not believe that this could actually happen. He still wondered why the prince was dying and everything was getting dark before his eyes, realizing that if this continues, this will be the first fainting spell in the blade's life. Those around Indrian Leonberg understood that if he took the throne, the kingdom would have no future. He was a man who had not inherited a drop of talent from the royal family, but who ranked first in arrogance. The very existence of Indrian Leonberg cast a shadow over future kingdoms. After the prince was pierced by a sword and woke up after being on the brink of life and death, strange rumors began to spread. Realizing that the prince had become very quiet, people assumed that he had finally remembered his conscience on the brink of death. However, Prince Indrian Leonberg himself was not at all interested in these rumors, because Grunhorn, having killed the descendant of his friend, surprisingly took over his body. In broad daylight, the maid, asking to tidy herself up, told how the king had arrived. In response, the blonde could not understand why the old man, who had not even visited him when he was dying, suddenly decided to pay him a visit. In response to this, the girl, noting the good hearing of the court knights, asked the prince to watch his words. The white-haired man suddenly appeared and shared how he heard that the prince had returned from the other world. Following this, she said that the main character needs to go to the Majesty. Noticing the boy's strange look, the mustachioed man emphasized how inappropriate it was to pretend that the student didn't know him. Hearing this, Grunhorn recognized that the man standing in front of him was a teacher. Then the main character decided to tell how his memory was severely damaged. At this moment, a voice was heard announcing that His Majesty the King had arrived. Returning to the main character, he thought about how the pig's father appeared in front of him. When the blonde man looked at the man who had appeared, he shared how he had expected something worse. After all, Grunhorn thought that over time, lion's blood degenerated into pigs. But looking at the king, he began to understand that this was not so, concluded the new owner of Indrian Leonberg's body. The people who had surrounded the king began to tell him about the tragedy. The prince had lost his memory. Thus, after such a meeting, the main character found himself on the bed for a body check. The bespectacled man, turning to His Majesty, told how he could not detect any abnormalities. However, it is possible that these are temporary symptoms caused by mental shock, the doctor suggested. Seeing the face, old Grunhorn emphasized how he could not believe this conclusion. Unexpectedly, the same mustachioed man noted how convenient all this was. The king then asked Indrian Leonberg if he thought that all the things that had happened would simply cease to exist. By making the wrong choice, you can commit acts that will be condemned by everyone, in order not to commit them later. But Indrian Leonberg forgot everything. And since they were in this situation as if nothing had happened, the prince had not moved a single step away from his past, the king concluded. He wanted to continue, but the mustachioed man, who had just interrupted the conversation, asked His Majesty to calm down. Grunhorn himself realized that he would be treated like a nobody. What angered him more was that the previous owner had done a lot of bad things for which he would have to pay. But then, to the main character's surprise, a hand suddenly appeared and grabbed him by the clothes. It was the woman, who is Indrian Leonberg's mother, who suggested that the boys were having a hard time. Hugging her little son, the dark-haired woman hoped for a quick return of her memory. Grabbing the boy by the cheeks, the queen was amazed at how thin her poor boy had become. But she was still glad that Indrian Leonberg had managed to open his eyes. She also said that her son should never touch dangerous objects again. The main character himself thought that the real owner of the body had already died long ago. Apologizing to the woman, Grunhorn concluded that it would indeed be difficult for him. After some time, the queen finally decided to give her son some rest. Left alone, the protagonist fell into thought, recalling his last moments. Remembering a friend's request to help the descendants of Grunhorn, he ended up killing one of them. Even though it happened by accident, one way or another he is the one who ended his life. Realizing this, the blonde decided to live a decent life for the sake of the body's past owner. He was reborn as a sword and spent his entire life cleaning up after others. But now it is he who must become a man with great power. Reflecting on his vast experience, Gruhorn intended to become a new legend. To begin with, the main character jumped from the chair and decided to form the mana heart. Taking a deep breath, he began to focus his energy on one point. However, despite the blonde's defeat, he was unable to achieve the desired result. Gruhorn couldn't believe that the mana had dissipated and the body was not going to accept the energy. At that time, Indri and Leonberg decided to try again to create the mana heart. But even after many attempts, the blonde was still unable to achieve the desired result. And in the end, the fat man fell to the floor, without a drop of strength. Feeling the enormous weight of Gruhorn, he couldn't understand why this body was so weak. After all, with such a constitution, he would usually have forced the mana inside. Suddenly, the servants at the door turned to His Majesty and asked for forgiveness. Entering the room, the maid said that she had brought medicine sent by the queen, after which she asked the young gentleman to accept it in the name of the queen's sincerity. The brunette herself, shifting her gaze to the side, recalling moments from the past, became very embarrassed. Remembering the prince's bad character, the girl began to imagine the worst outcome. The main character, to put it mildly, was amazed when he saw the cup that was brought. And all because this medicine emitted a small aura of focused mana. Without waiting long, the blonde grabbed the cup with one sharp movement which greatly surprised the maid. And then, to the girl's even greater dismay, the prince began to swallow the medicine in continuous gulps. Watching this picture, the brunette was speechless, because she had recently been thinking about another reaction from Indri and Leonberg. Having emptied the cup, the protagonist allowed the maid to go, while he himself intended to try to create the mana heart again. After the servants left, the blonde immediately began to focus his energy on one point. He understood that this amount of mana would not be enough. It would only last for one day. Understanding this, the prince, finding himself in the corridor at the same moment, called out to the maid. Pointing to the cup with the medicine, he asked if there was any more. And after a few days, the protagonist finally managed to collect the desired amount of mana, to finally put an end to the long-term creation of Mana Heart. Thinking back to his past, Gruhorn noted how he could create a Mana Heart with his eyes closed. But then, to the boy's surprise, he felt a strong pain in the area of his heart. At the same time, the Sword of Heroes understood why his past comrades had changed their faces when creating a heart. And all because the creation of the Mana Heart was always supposed to be painful. The blonde also realized that if he lost consciousness, there would be an outflow of mana, because of which all the accumulated mana will spill out, thereby killing the owner. Thinking about this, the protagonist decided to focus on surviving. Then the boy mentally grabbed hold of the clot of mana, trying to break free. Without thinking about hurrying, Gruhorn followed the path along the heart, thereby allowing the heart to be nourished. The required amount of mana, which will be used to create the Mana Heart. And after some time, the process was successfully completed to the delight of the prince. The blonde thought about the first time he created the Mana Heart for someone other than himself. And personally, this thought greatly pleased and amused the main character. Rejoicing at such a significant event in his new life, the blonde did not notice one thing at first. It was a system window with text about the successful creation of the Mana Heart, seeing which, Gruhorn remembered how he sent the same to his masters. Then, many windows began to appear around the main character with a wide variety of information, one of which was access to one of the powers called the Third Eye. Following this, the main character decided to take advantage of his new acquisition, with the help of which Gruhorn was able to see the leaves of a distant tree as if they were close to him. Using the power called the Third Ear, the boy heard someone talking behind the wall. It was a group of maids gathered together, heatedly discussing something. Unexpectedly, to the main character's surprise, he felt an unbearable pain. Holding his head, the prince thought about how his mana had quickly accumulated. The absolute senses that Gruhorn possessed as a sword that covered all directions without blind spots were now gone. The current mana reserves of the Sword of Heroes are only enough to eavesdrop on sounds behind the door or see a little better. Thinking about this, the blonde also realized that by expanding the volume of mana, he could become better. The next second, the boy emphasized how hungry he was. Having ordered the servants to serve dinner, Gruhorn decided to first focus on adapting to his body. A few moments later, the queen, meeting her son, could not hide her joy. While hugging the boy, she shared how she heard that he drank the medicine sent to her. By this time, another man dressed in dark clothes entered the room of this duo. The queen turned to her son and asked him if he remembered this man. This man turned out to be the brother of the queen, who decided to entrust her child to him. The dark-haired girl then noted how the prince was her brother's only nephew. The man with the scar noted how the prince's past was not pleasant. The same dark-haired man decided to immediately clarify one thing. All he can do is help Indrian Leonberg lose weight. After all, he can't give more, so the sister should abandon any foolish hopes, concluded the man with the scar. The queen, hearing this, thanked her brother for such help. Following this, the uncle's contemptuous gaze turned towards his nephew, and just a few moments later, Indrian Leonberg fell face down on the ground. The dark-haired man who approached declared that from now on the prince would eat and drink only with his permission. Then he, telling the boys not to give up, added that he might even change his mind and teach his nephew something. The main character himself could not believe that now someone would teach him. Thinking about how in the past I trained the invincible knight who became the founder of this country, Indrian Leonberg approached his uncle with an offer to make a bet. The prince intended to force the dark-haired man to recognize him within 6 months. The loser is obliged to do everything that the winner orders, the boy concluded. Hearing this proposal, the man with the scar found it quite interesting, after which he decided to agree because he needed at least some entertainment while he was studying with him. Having started training, the main character thought about his recently spoken words. Realizing all the shortcomings of his body, Gruhorn decided to resort to using mana, with the help of which he will be able to strengthen his physical characteristics. At one time, when Uncle saw his student's aura, he couldn't believe that it was real. The dark-haired man stopped his nephew with one sharp movement and turned to him, after which the same uncle hastily assumed that the prince had created the mana heart. After this question, Gruhorn himself shared how he created it a long time ago. But then the man with the scar called Indrian Leonberg a fool and asked what he was thinking about the cake. Seeing the student's face, he assumed that he did not understand his mistake at all. After these words, the main character looked questioningly at the dark-haired man. Then my uncle told me that only mercenaries and other riffraff use this technology. At that very moment, the boy's cry of surprise was heard throughout the entire castle. Once outside of training, the protagonist began to think about everything the teacher had said. He especially remembered how the dark-haired man called the owners of the mana heart scum. After these words, the boy asked his uncle why he thought so. Then he decided to demonstrate a more advanced swordsmanship skill. The ring formed by mana was sent straight towards the protagonist. This chain was able to destroy the aura created by the mana heart. Moreover, this skill is much easier and more stable to use, the uncle shared. Even Count Eli's family, who clung to the heart of mana, fell into complete decline 100 years ago. After such a fruitful conversation, Gruhorn decided to familiarize himself with the basics of mana chains. There the boy learned how mages now also use mana rings. Returning to the knights, in the new era of Gruhorn, they now weave chains to collect mana. At this time, the knight's level is determined by the number of chains woven. Having closed the book, the protagonist concluded with dissatisfaction that times had changed. Among the words he read, the blonde saw a rather familiar name, Altrigan, and a moment later the main character remembered the person to whom this name belonged. Long ago, Gruhorn and his close friend met that same Alitrigani. He, having drawn his blade, wanted to know who was more worthy of the title of Holy Sword. Now the boy understood why this name seemed quite familiar to him. Remembering this person, Gruhorn became curious about what happened to him. The next clear day, the prince's servants witnessed the young master's preparations. The uncle arrived and asked his nephew if he had read the book he recommended. Following this, he speculated on how the boy had realized his mistake in choosing the mana heart. In response, Indrian Leonberg shared how he doesn't feel even the slightest mistake. Sighing heavily, the dark-haired man asked the student whether he didn't want to admit it or simply didn't understand. To which the main character, focusing his mana in his hand, only grinned. After which he emphasized that the difference lies in the class of use of the mana heart. Hearing this, the man with the scar called Indrian Leonberg's words nonsense. He then noted how among the mercenaries there are those who consider themselves heroes. But in the end, all these people soon die without ever having managed to surpass even 2 chains. And if the prince imagines himself to be the same, then let him defeat the owner of 2 chains, suggested the uncle. And if he succeeds, then the dark-haired one will become Indrian Leonberg's guardian, he concluded. The blonde had once noted that having one's own uncle as a guard was a strange idea. After these words, the man with the scar asked the prince, who doubted his qualifications. He decided to remind everyone that he was the count of the kingdom and the commander of the northern army. In addition to this, He also holds the position of Master of the Black Spearman. Having introduced himself as Baal Wallerhard, the man concluded that he was a knight of the fourth chain. Feeling the enormous pressure of the aura, the protagonist clenched his teeth in displeasure. The prince's knights appeared and ordered the man with the scar to lower his blade. Indrian Leyenberg said that his uncle should not take his words back. A little later, the main character found himself on the ground after a grueling training session. As he made his way through the castle corridor, Gruhorn couldn't believe he had survived. He remembered his uncle's words, how he noted that if his nephew were to defeat even a single chain, it would be nothing but luck. Reflecting on what had happened, the protagonist moved further down the corridor. When the door to the room opened, a male voice was heard from there. It was a physician who was very glad to greet His Majesty. Hearing the prince's question, he said that he had come for healing. Seeing the doctor trying to get down to his work, Gruhorn refused. Having sent the bespectacled man away, the main character declared that he didn't need it. An angry Indrian Leyenberg was amazed that the doctor wanted to undo all the hell he had experienced. The long-haired knight standing behind was amazed by the young master's knowledge. After some time, a boy burst into the main character's room. Without stopping his meal, the blonde wondered who this unexpected guest was. At one time, the knight decided to remind that this boy was the third prince. Recalling the recent accident, he noted how well his brother looked. Without waiting, Indrian Leyenberg asked the brown-haired man why he had come. Hearing the tone of his interlocutor, the third prince became angry, remembering the stupidity of his brother, how he himself stabbed the sword into himself. Then the brown-haired man decided to get down to business, sharing that he had received some interesting news. Namely, a bet with his uncle, a duel between Indrian Leyenberg and the Knight of the Double Chain. After which, the third prince approached and offered his candidacy for a duel. Finding himself without any extra people in the room, the main character made a displeased face. Thinking about the third prince, Gruhorn couldn't understand why the Leyenberg descendants were so strange. The long-haired man standing behind him explained how Jillian, the third prince, was known for his talent in fencing. After all, at his young age, he managed to form 2 chains. The maid suddenly appeared and apologized for interrupting the conversation. Showing a whole stack of letters, the girl said that they were all addressed to the prince. The blonde himself could not understand why so many people remembered Indrian Leyenberg. When the main character began to unpack the letters, he became thoughtful. The senders wanted to become partners for a duel against the prince. In fact, all these people wanted to legally beat up the previous owner of the body. Clutching another letter in anger, Gruhorn noted how he was considered an easy target, after which the young master turned to the maid opposite him. The boy ordered that all the names of the senders of these ill-fated letters be written down. The next day, the protagonist's hard training began again. The uncle, looking at the abandoned weapon, ordered his nephew to pick up the sword. He decided to teach the prince the basics of fencing so that their bet would remain valid. After all, he doesn't want to hear the blonde whine that he lost because he didn't know the basics. When the main character raised his weapon, he felt a piercing pain in his muscles. The uncle who approached asked Indrian Leyenberg if he had been cured by magic. In response, the protagonist noted how the dark-haired knight should understand. That magic only returns muscles to their original state, but does not help them grow. The man with the scar, surprised by these words, noted how he was telling the truth. Baal Wallerhard turned around and decided to end this conversation and return to training. Having put out his blade, he told his nephew to watch his actions carefully. This technique is studied by the knights of the kingdom to lay the foundation. The next moment, the dark-haired man began to swing his sword furiously. And after a couple more seconds, the man with the scar stopped abruptly. Thus, a circle of air was created around Baal Wallerhard, raising dust. The main character, observing this, was, to put it mildly, amazed by what he saw. Then the boy recalled how his uncle said that knights of this style build their foundation on this. To which the dark-haired man noted how even with this his nephew might not be able to cope. But then the man with the scar heard laughter coming from the student. The main character, not hiding his laughter, thought about how no matter how much time had passed, the great swordsmanship that slew the dragon is now considered a mere training technique, which made Gruhorn laugh a lot, as he had personally seen this technique defeat a powerful creature. Afterwards, the teacher decided to teach the prince something else, but he surprisingly refused. And all because Gruhorn does not want to study other styles besides his own. I consider the current Dragon Slayer style to be a normal training technique. As sad as it is still natural, thought the main character. And the technique demonstrated by Baal Wallerhard does not have the will to kill dragons. Those who have abandoned the mana heart and forgotten how to infuse their will into the blade are simply unable to discern the true value of the Dragon Slayer. The unexpected appearance of his uncle's blade stopped the blonde's thoughts. He also reminded how power should gradually flow from the body into the sword. By hitting the protagonist in the stomach, Baal Valhard reminded him how strength should be throughout the entire body. Having hit the legs, he added that everything listed above depends on the stance. Ultimately, he concluded that to wield a sword, one must distribute force correctly throughout the body. Having risen, Gruhorn understood that with such a body he would not be able to repeat even a pathetic imitation of the Dragon Slayer. But he wants to prove that this style is not trash that can be thrown away like worn-out pieces of paper. Thus, a whole month of training passed, due to which a system window appeared and a change in physique was obtained. The trait morbid obesity has changed to regular obesity. Thanks to this change, the metabolism accelerated, and repeated training helped the body get used to it a little. Reading through all the system windows, the boy noted how he was swinging his sword much more naturally than a month ago. Today's swing was much better than yesterday's. This flawless feeling greatly pleased Gruhorn. In his joy, the boy didn't notice how his blade was broken in two, and a moment later he felt a pouring rain on himself. Indrian Leyenberg's training was so intense that he didn't notice the bleeding. Large drops of blood fell down directly into the puddle, coloring it red. But what struck the main character more was the fact that in front of him was a table made of charred boards. The dark-haired man who approached called the prince a fool for training in such weather. After all, if the boy had had a real blade, he would not have been able to leave alive. At one time, system windows appeared with an exit from the state of extreme concentration. In addition, the main character managed to acquire a new trait, super concentration. He thought that if he concentrated like that again, he would definitely be struck by lightning. Following this, Indrian Leyenberg collapsed, exhausted, into the arms of his teacher. The same one, looking at his nephew's face, called him a stupid boy. After some time, the main character woke up in his bed. Gruhorn stood up and realized that he had lost consciousness after the training. He realized his mistake, as he did not take into account the limits of his new body. Being a sword, he achieved everything that could be achieved, such as a nameless war hero, a master of the sword, a king of mercenaries and the founder of a kingdom. Gruhorn led wars to victory, elevated the status of his flesh and soul, and guided heroes along the right path. The Sword of Heroes was a wise advisor and an outstanding teacher to his comrades. However, he was a being who always remained only an outside observer. That is why he swung his sword until he reached his current state, intoxicated by the feeling that the sweat, the effort, and all the fruits were completely his. It's been a whole month since Gruhorn created the Mana Heart. Since he had accumulated a lot of mana during this time, he would soon be able to move on to the next stage. Having begun to refine the Mana Heart, it was expanded. Now the main character's body has become capable of withstanding a slightly larger volume. In addition, the prince managed to gain additional growth in his physical abilities. Seeing all the system windows in front of him, the blonde was only happy. Noticing a blade nearby, the boy decided to test the powers he had acquired. When Indrian Leyenberg took up the blade, a system window appeared with the rank of Sword Apprentice. Looking at his reflection, Gruhorn emphasized how he could now use the basic level of aura. Finding himself at another training session, Uncle noted how rumors had spread throughout the kingdom. Rumors about the prince's bet even gave the dark-haired man a headache. Then he asked his nephew whether it wouldn't be easier for him to quickly find an opponent. The main character himself, remembering one person, shared how he had already found an opponent for himself. With this thought in mind, the blonde asked, "How about warming up with a single chain?" Turning to Carl, the boy asked about his request. The long-haired man remembered her and told the young gentleman that all those who wanted to were on the list. However, the knight was curious whether the prince was really going to conduct training fights with these people. And all because most of these people harbored a grudge against the boy. Listening to his subordinate, Indrian Leyenberg said that he knew everything. But for this to happen, his uncle must become the judge of his training fights. Seeing the dark-haired man's displeased face, the prince added that he only needed to make sure that no one died. And a few days later, the first day of training duels arrived. The first candidate was amazed to see the fat bastard's palace. This man's name is Taylor Tailheim, the second son of an ordinary baronial family. Having returned several years into the past, the previous owner of Leyenberg's body could not hide his laughter. Pointing his finger at the wealthy man opposite, the blonde man called him a redneck. That day, the family's honor was trampled, and the father of the family and his brother are still a laughingstock among the nobility. Today, the red-haired man intended to make the fat man pay dearly for that day. Finding himself before the princes, Taylor Talheim greeted his majesty. "Prepare for battle." The red-haired man introduced himself with his name. Pointing his finger at his opponent, the boy asked Karl if he was really a knight. Hearing these words, Taylor Talheim thought how true the rumors circulating around Indrian were. Unexpectedly, Bale, sharing his understanding with the red-haired man, asked him to pull himself together. When Taylor Talheim saw Lord Valorhard in front of him, he could not hide his admiration. After bowing, he shared that it was a great honor to meet him. Observing this, Gruhorn noted how one could think that the prince here was not he, but his uncle. The dark-haired man noted that his nephew should have behaved better in the past. And after some time, the man with the scar asked the two to get ready. When Taylor Talheim heard about the start of the duel, he immediately began to activate the single chain. The red-haired man rushed forward and told the young master to get ready. Without thinking twice, the knight rose above his enemy to deliver his attack. At one time, the main character noted many unnecessary movements in his opponent, and a moment later, the two blades crossed, producing a metallic ringing sound. Taylor Talheim was shocked to see his opponent holding the mana heart. Then Indrian threw his opponent in the opposite direction. Once at a distance, the red-haired man noted how the mana heart should not block the mana chain. At the time, the main character replied that he was only ticklish. At that moment, Taylor Talheim became very wary because he heard a strange sound from the enemy. The knights watching the duel immediately realized that it was the humming of a sword. Uncle also understood that this was not just a hum, but the resonance of the sword. Following this, the red-haired man rushed towards his enemy, intending to finish him off. A few seconds later, the blades of the two clashed again in competition. But again, the same two were separated by several meters. Gruhorn thought about how the mana from chains or mana rings was incompatible with the mana heart. Holding onto his energy heart, the boy understood how the mana rollback could happen at any moment. Then the prince turned to the angry second son of Baron Talheim. Pointing a blade at him, the protagonist stated that he needed to cool down a bit. At the same time, Indrian closed his eyes and decided to concentrate on the sensations. Once in his consciousness, the boy felt like he was in a bottomless lake. Be it demonic or holy or countless other names of the sword. This is a part of Gruhorn's soul. At that moment, the mana heart took on a colossal will. The colorless mana heart began to take on color. Thus, the Dragon Slayer's seated will began to awaken. The sword's memory of recent battles and the essence of the heart created to slay dragons were combined. When the main character opened his eyes, they were painted scarlet. Behind was the embodiment of a majestic creature of the same color. What the prince's opponent saw before him was indescribable in words. Looking at the terrifying incarnation of Taylor, Talheim wanted to understand what was going on. At one time, the referee of this fight ordered his nephew to stop. But Gruhorn, not hearing his uncle's words, rushed towards his opponent with the intention of winning. Returning to the past, the protagonist asked the dark-haired man to fulfill his request. Keep an eye on him so that the prince does not kill his opponent during the duel. Recalling this fragment of memory, Bale Valorhard took up the blade, after which, in an instant, he found himself behind the blonde using the chain. Indrian then found himself under attack from the dark-haired man, who sent him flying. The surrounding guards decided to remind him again how the knight could be punished for such actions. Hearing these words, Gruhorn, leaning on his own sword, ordered his subordinates to stop. He also told how he asked his own uncle to watch the fight. But in the end, after such a strong blow, the young gentleman lost consciousness. When the boy woke up, he thought about how his mana heart could have cracked in this duel. He also noticed how Bale's strength was definitely different from that of a normal single chain wielder. And fortunately, after such a strong blow, everything went without consequences. What pleased the main character most was the thought that he had been able to win the duel. The uncle who entered the room asked his nephew what he was happy about. Then the dark-haired man asked the prince if he understood what he had done. Recalling the strange style of the sword, he also noted how he had never taught his nephew such a thing. In response to this, Gruhorn replied that he was only following the essence of his own blade. Hearing these words, Bale Valorhard began to think about his nephew, after which he concluded that the essence of the boy's sword was the thirst for murder. Realizing that this was how the man with the scar noticed how there was some truth in it. In response, the protagonist asked the man opposite if he wasn't overcome with pride in admitting this. He chuckled and shared that he thought the prince would grumble about the blade's perfection. Then he reminded himself that as a soldier, he walks the path of victory, not righteousness. However, the boy's style is a bit much, Bale stated, which made the boy tense up. He also added that if the thirst for murder clouded his mind, the blonde would cease to distinguish between his own and others. Understanding Uncle Indrian's point of view, he assumed that he had made such a noise during the duel in order to protect the others. In response, the dark-haired man stated that from now on he would watch the student. After 3 days of hard training, the boy tried to remember his opponent's name. Having finished another training session, the prince shared how he managed to remember the red-haired man. He himself reflected on how well this boy had worked in 3 days. Turning to Taylor Tailheim, he explained how he understood that the red-haired man wanted to take revenge on him, but he failed. After these words, the main character called the maid and told her to bring the box. By telling how he lost his memory, Gruhorn decided to make amends. Having handed over the box filled with gold and a letter, the prince asked that it be passed on to Baron Tailheim. The next second, Indrian turned around sharply and said goodbye. In response to such generosity, the red-haired man thanked the young gentleman. As a result, the scoundrel prince's training duels became the main topic of conversation in the kingdom. People whispered among themselves about how the prince would pay for his antics. However, even after several days, the expected news still did not arrive. All who had the honor of fighting Indrian were grateful to him for the sincere duel. At the time, others, hearing these words, could not believe that it was true. This led the dissatisfied to conclude that the royal family had shut everyone's mouths. The dark-haired man standing behind him noted how his nephew was to blame for it. Turning to his recent training partner, Gruhorn asked him to tell everyone about the results of the duel, after which the main character decided that now the rumors should stop. But the next day, the blonde boy ended up getting bad news from the maid. The girl told how people say that the gentleman threatens to set knights on the duelists, because of which they do not tell the truth. After listening to the servant Indrian, the wooden sword, clutching his anger, decided to simply train. After asking Karl how many enemies were left, the knight told how only one man remained today. In response, the blonde shared how he no longer had enough newcomers for fights, after which the knight assured the master that an opponent who was skilled in wielding a blade awaited him. Someone for whom simply honing the family art is not enough. A talent who joined the order for the sake of training. Upon learning that his next opponent would be a candidate of the Order of the Iron Lions, the boy was delighted. By this time, the very same upcoming opponent found himself on the territory of the prince's palace. The knights immediately began to whisper about the girl with the Iron Lion's coat of arms. This girl was compared to a flower on a cliff, because she was the one who broke the hearts of many men. All the same knights were amazed that such a charming girl came here herself. The most interesting thing for the threads was what Indrian's reaction would be when he lost to the girl. The Order of the Iron Lions, or simply the Iron Lions, is known as one of the finest orders in the kingdom. Arvin Kurgayan is on probation in this order. Having learned who his next opponent was, the prince became curious as to why such a genius would want to duel him. Karl decided to tell how a misunderstanding had occurred between the gentleman and her. Turning to his chief servant, Indrian asked her to tell him everything. At one time, the green-eyed girl heard such a request from the young master, but a few seconds later she shared how the prince had harassed that girl in the past. Having learned about this, the main character began to insult the previous owner of this body. Returning to the past at the next ball, the boy began to harass Arwen. The girl did not intend to tolerate this, which is why she pushed the blonde's hand away. At one time, I was amazed by such ignorance towards myself. Not wanting to tolerate this, Indrian began to insult the dark-haired woman opposite him. At this time, the new owner of the body was amazed by the audacity of the real Indrian. He thought how similar this was to the perverted advances of a scoundrel. After all, no one in their right mind would call this girl ugly, concluded Gruhorn, looking at his opponent. The blonde himself, thinking about the bad deeds he had committed, hesitated in front of the girl. But then Count Wallerhard appeared just in time and headed straight towards the duo. At the sight of this man, Arwen Kurgayan greeted the count opposite. Bale himself asked the girl to be more careful, because the prince sometimes swings his sword too vigorously. And a few moments later, the same uncle announced in a loud voice that the duel was about to begin. Gruhorn was curious about what the Iron Lion's hope was capable of. At the time, Arwen Kurgayan had no intention of standing on ceremony with her opponent. Crossing his blades, the boy thought about how the dark-haired girl had pretty good movements. After bleeding, Indrian realized how the mana began to flow back. Then the two began to exchange swings of their swords. At one point, the boy began to understand how his opponent was in complete control of the fight. Then he decided to change the course of the battle by taking the initiative in this battle. Thus began the desired activation of the Dragon Slayer's heart. Arwen Kurgayan was shocked at the sight of the suddenly appearing red aura. But then the blonde took his opponent's blow with the help of the blade's aura. Realizing that the blow had not gone as it should have, the dark-haired girl was even more surprised. Once she was at a distance, she thought about how strange the sword style was. The boy noted how not all owners of a single chain are alike. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of the boy with the ability to use the court authority. Without thinking twice, the protagonist took advantage of this ability, which allowed him to learn all of his enemy's information, realizing that he can use this limited power on his opponent. This means that Arwen Kurgayan is weaker or equal in strength to the prince. Rushing towards his opponent, Indrian noted how their battle was only just beginning. After some time, the two, engrossed in the battle, did not notice the approaching evening. The dark-haired man stopped the battle and said that it was enough for today and they would continue the duel tomorrow. Wiping away his sweat, the protagonist shared just as he was about to finish. The girl, hearing these words, also spoke about her intentions to put an end to the fight. Thus, the two began to exchange words, suggesting to continue the duel. But Baal Valorhard, who was standing nearby, had no intention of listening to these two. The dark-haired man emphasized how it was already too late to continue the fight. The doctor who arrived in time began to treat His Majesty, rejoicing at the approval. At this time, Gruhorn himself focused his gaze on the girl standing behind him. At one time, Arwen Kurgayan also looked at the main character, thinking about her own. As they approached the upcoming fight, the two had no intention of giving in to each other. 3 days later, the knights discussed among themselves the duration of the duel. The red-haired man said he had heard about the girl's skills, but the first prince's skills were no less impressive. They hoped that this would be the last day of the battle between Indrian and Arwen. At this time, the boy, turning to his rival, wanted to say something. Hearing this, the dark-haired girl, not believing it, assumed that he wanted to apologize. After which, looking coldly at the prince, she said that she would not accept an apology. Hearing this, the protagonist added that this was not the issue at all, and then he remarked that there should be a prize for such a fierce battle. The prize will be the winner's wish coming true, Gruhorn suggested. The girl, hearing this, to put it mildly, was surprised by the blonde's harsh words. The knights gathered behind were also shocked, because a member of the royal family should not throw around such words. The first prince then asked his rival again whether she agreed with these conditions. In response, the girl reminded him that she was only a subject of the Leonberg family. However, she cannot refuse such an interesting offer. Hearing these words, Indrian replied that the girl had spoken very well. Rushing towards each other, they promised not to go back on their words. The next moment, the blades of the two crossed, creating sparks. Using a single chain, Arwen Kurgayan aimed a swing at her opponent. In response, the main character simply accepted the attack with lightning speed and joy on his face. The dark-haired girl thought about how her opponent had moved more slowly yesterday. When she looked at the boy, she felt a murderous aura on herself. After many blows, the protagonist managed to take the initiative. The girl barely dodged and felt the full danger of her enemy. When the two were at a distance, Arwen Kurgayan was tired by this time. The first prince himself, not intending to wait for his opponent, rushed towards him. And in the end, Arwen Kurgayan's blade was broken in two, which meant defeat. The knights watching this spectacle were amazed at the outcome of the battle. As for the dark-haired one, she couldn't believe she lost. Having celebrated his victory, Indrian decided to take advantage of the winner's prize. He desired his rival, which greatly surprised Arwen Kurgayan. The position of royal guard for the infamous prince turned out to be easy for Charles. On the very first day, the long-haired man bowed his head before the young gentleman and introduced himself. Indrian seemed a little arrogant to him, but he didn't throw tantrums over every little thing, although there were rumors to the contrary. On that very day of training, Karl was also present, keeping an eye on the boy. Other knights, noting the heavy rain, suggested stopping the prince for his own safety. Noticing the sudden appearance of the glow, the long-haired man shouted at the young gentleman. But a moment later, lightning flashed across the entire area, striking near Indrian. In fact, contrary to rumors, Karl felt that His Highness would become a great man. But that was earlier, because after the boy's wish, the knight's thoughts about it changed. The others standing nearby were also shocked by Indrian's shameless statement. Returning to Karl, he wondered if he had been mistaken about the prince. As for Arwen Kurgayan, she asked if this was really what the prince wanted. In response, the boy, confirming his words, noted how the girl is now an ordinary knight. Therefore, he wants to unlock the potential of the swordsman and get a good warrior named Arwen Kurgayan. He needs a knight who will follow him despite any obstacles, and not the one who guards him simply by order of the royal family. He needs a man who exclusively serves him, the protagonist concluded. Looking at all the girl's characteristics in the system window, the boy would be glad to get such a person, so the same first prince asked the girl if she wanted to become his knight. Arwen Kurgayan herself always dreamed of this, but no one saw a knight in her. Everyone saw in the girl only refined beauty and not the skills of a knight. That's why the dark-haired one always worked twice as hard as the others. As a result, Arwen Kurgayan, possessing the power she had received, defeated any candidate. And when the girl won one victory after another, everyone still had a different opinion. Because of this, in the end, the girl was never able to achieve what she wanted, to become a knight. But now everything has changed. The first prince himself was able to notice her potential. Following this, the dark-haired girl turned to His Majesty, asking him to promise one thing. She wanted the boy to treat her not as a woman, but as a knight. After all, in that case, she would fulfill the will of the young master, Arwen Kurgayan declared. Without thinking twice, the main character, with joy on his face, promised the man across from him to fulfill this request. And at that very moment, the dark-haired girl, having received the desired words, bowed before the blonde. Then she, using her own name, swore allegiance to Prince Indrian. The knights standing behind were amazed at this turn of events. Gruhorn, not breaking with tradition, as the legitimate heir of Leonberg, knighted the girl. Lowering his blade, the boy ordered his new subordinate, "Be brave, be polite, and, lastly, be devoted to him," the blonde concluded. When the girl returned to her place, a group of people watching the girl discussed the beauty. Remembering the oath they had taken, the punks wanted to somehow annul it. At the same time, rumors began to spread about the love affair between Indrian and Arwen Kurgayan. Having learned about which, the main character, tearing his hair, could not believe that he was considered so bad. Carl, standing nearby, watched the young gentleman's displeasure with surprise. Suddenly, the long-haired man turned to His Majesty standing opposite him. Remembering the final day of the duel between the prince and Arwen Kurgayan, he was interested. Regarding the words about the loyalty of the knight who will follow him, and not the one who guards by order of the crown. Having confirmed his words, the boy noted how if a royal decree came for Charles to leave, he would obey. But if the long-haired one wants, he can also take an oath, Indrian concluded. After these words, the knight asked if he had done so, whether the master would have accepted him. To which the main character, turning away, answered negatively in one word. After all, he doesn't need Carl because he has no interest in developing him. The boy then received a letter informing him that Indrian's house arrest had been lifted. Reading the contents, he became interested in why he was being released a month and a half early. After all, the evil father acted as if he would lock up the first prince forever. Hearing the young gentleman's thoughts out loud, Carl noted how happy he should be about the lifting of house arrest. Then the blonde shared how he didn't care because he had nowhere to go. Suddenly, the maid, having read another letter, let out a surprised squeak. Turning to His Majesty, she told him about the invitation for that. Following this, the little girl handed the letter to the young gentleman opposite. Having opened it, the boy learned about the club for special young lords. Hearing this, the maid said that this was a social gathering in which the prince was a member. Noting the name of the place, the main character called it very strange. In response, the brunette said that she, as an ordinary girl, could not understand the refined tastes of young lords. Understanding what this event was, Indrian declared that he did not need this useless gathering. Then the boy noticed a personal message from Bernardo from the Eli family, who introduced himself as an eternal friend of the prince. Clinging to the name of the family, Gruhorn tried to remember something about it. Then he remembered how his uncle had said that this family had clung to the Mana Hearts until the very end. And in the end, the blonde shared that he would still go to this place. The main character himself hoped that this family had not yet completely rotted. It's been 4 months since Gruhorn took over the prince's body and began training to lose weight. The tailor, looking at his creation on the young gentleman, could not hide his joy. The bespectacled man emphasized how the main character's body had shrunk by more than half. At that very moment, Indrian announced that he was entrusting the preparation of the outfit for the palace banquet to the tailor. Smiling, the blonde noted how his size would change by then. And now Gruhorn is already on his way to a club for wealthy aristocrats. Sighing in the carriage, Indrian thought how hard it was to be a prince. The clothes, guards, and many other factors greatly irritated the main character. Suddenly, the young gentleman, noticing something, turned to the maid opposite. Looking at the girl's scar, Gruhorn asked her where such a wound came from. In response, the brunette apologetically shared how the first prince punished her for her mistakes. The main character himself, learning more and more about the past of the real prince, became increasingly angry. Looking at the brunette, he noted how, having been with her for several months, he still had not found out her name. And a moment later, Indrian asked his servant what her name was. At that very moment, the girl introduced herself as Adelia Bayern, which amazed the blonde. Catching on to the name of the family, the blue-eyed man thought about how this family was barely listed among the nobility. In the distant past, when there were no cities or kingdoms, among the many races of the continent in an era when weak people were robbed and killed with impunity, those appeared who put an end to the miserable existence of humanity, elevating people. At the end of the Great War, the saviors who allowed humans to become masters of the continent were called the Five Chosen Ones, and one of these 5 heroes was the owner of the Sword of Heroes, or as it is otherwise known, Gruhorn. Looking at the huge crowd of monsters, the red-haired girl was only glad to meet the enemies. The one who beheaded Edu, the king of the giants, and ended the era of oppression. One of the 5 heroes, Agnes Bayern, nicknamed the Iron Blood Marquise. Only this girl had a very interesting feature that Gruhorn really didn't like. This was obscene language, the sounds of which would make even the shoemaker from the nearest village feel ashamed. While in the hands of such a hero, the protagonist was constantly ashamed of his master. And even now, just the memories and thoughts make Gruhorn's ears ache. Looking at the heiress of this great family, the boy became curious about what had happened to her. But then, to the main character's surprise, his carriage stopped abruptly, which meant one thing. He was in place, and when Karl opened the carriage, his gaze caught the gentleman's face. Seeing the strange appearance of the milord, he wanted to ask, but Indrian asked the knight to remain silent. Coming down, the blond man pointed his finger at the brunette and promised to talk later. The white-haired man who appeared greeted his highness. Bowing his head, he introduced himself to the prince as that same Bernard from the house of Eli. The boy himself, looking at the blond man, decided to find out what characteristics the descendant of the Eli family had. When the main character saw the system window in front of him, he was amazed. After which, squeezing out a strange grin, the blonde laughed to himself, seeing which the white-haired man asked what had happened. In response, Indrian put his hand on Bernard's shoulder and thanked him for the invitation. And after some time, that very secular meeting of young lords began. The boy, sitting in a circle of drunkenness and debauchery, surprisingly did nothing, which even made the fair-haired man emphasize the strangeness of the young gentleman. After all, he was usually lying around drunk and trying to hit on each one 10 minutes after his appearance. Suddenly, one of the drunkards remembered how the prince managed to pick the Iron Lioness's flower. He also shared how he had had his eye on this girl for a long time but didn't have time. Thinking about the dark-haired girl, the drunkard was already verbally trying to seduce the girl. Suddenly, by this time, the first prince asked if the man had brothers or sisters. Then he decided to remind the young master that he had a younger brother. And the next second after these words, a fist was aimed at the drunkard, under the power of which the young lord was sent to the ground with lightning speed. This amazed the nearby offspring of aristocrats, like everyone else. Indrian, intending to strike the next blow, concluded that the drunkard's line would not be interrupted, after which a frantic cry of animal pain was heard throughout the room. Then the boy declared that from that moment on, the heir would be the worthless man's younger brother. Looking at another fist raised to strike, the dark-haired man asked why the prince was beating him. In response, Indrian stated that he would not tolerate anyone considering him that fat man. Hearing this strange statement, people assumed that the blond man's brain had gone crazy. The main character himself hit the drunkard in the face again, not intending to tolerate it. Having finished with one non-entity, the protagonist called Bernard. He, with a terrible face, recalled the blond man's words about how fun it should be today. The long-haired man himself could not understand why my lord was behaving strangely. Following this, Indrian ordered the white-haired man to bring the royal knights. Not intending to refuse, Bernard immediately rushed to carry out the order. Following this, Gruhorn, noticing the girls, told them to leave quickly. But then one of the aristocrats, realizing that things were getting hot, decided to also run away. However, the boy noticed this, which is why he reminded him that he told only girls to leave. But still, the dark-haired one can go if he wants. But first, the prince suggested resolving the issue of gender. Thus, the assembled rabble of young aristocrats fell silent, awaiting further action. At the same time, Indrian noticed how no one present deigned to kneel before the prince. And despite all the other factors, the worst thing is that they dared to insult the blonde knight. Turning to the knights who had arrived, the boy asked what charges could be brought in such a case. In response, one of them said that since the accused had disregarded their status, it was an insult to the crown and the entire family. Hearing these words, the rabble of aristocrats could not believe that this was all real. Karl, however, noted with displeasure how they questioned the authority of the royal family, after which the long-haired man asked the young gentleman to order who to put on their knees. Then the main character, with a grin, ordered everyone to be brought to their knees. And sometime after such a stormy meeting, the prince found himself before his father. He was amazed at how the blonde managed to arrest 14 children of noble families. Turning to the boy, the king asked him if he understood what he had done. He himself thought about how he would have to punish Indrian, since the family of those children had weight in society. Suddenly, the prince spoke up and asked his father if he was afraid of the consequences. He then noted how the children of aristocrats are outcasts from their families or trash that only tarnishes the honor of the family by their existence. Having finished with this, the protagonist told his father to send the letters. In response, the king, not understanding who to send the letters to, decided to inquire. Then Indrian suggested sending letters to the brothers and sisters of the arrested nobodies so that they could settle the fuss themselves. After these words, the king, after remaining silent for some time, allowed his son to go. After some time, the main character, after a fruitful conversation, tried to calm the maid down. Adelia Byrne herself had already begun to apologize to the gentleman without knowing why. Seeing the girl's fear, the boy noted how the previous owner of the body had tortured the girl quite a bit. Even direct descendants know nothing about the Byrne family. Their glorious history has been erased, and the unrivaled art of fencing was lost to this day. The status, respect, pride I had received all disappeared without a trace, but still, Adelia Byrne has unimaginable characteristics in front of the prince. But among these there were also unusual qualities, such as a slavish nature. Having learned all the information about the girl, Gruhorn realized that she did not have a single trait to restrain her thirst for blood. He also wondered whether this personality could be released into the world at all. But in the end, the protagonist, despite the odds, decided to take a risk. Yet there was one trait the prince could use, a trait that would give him great joy in serving his master. Without thinking twice, the blonde turned to Adelia Byrne and asked her to swear allegiance to him. Hearing this, the green-eyed girl, surprised, asked the gentleman what he meant, to which the boy decided to repeat it differently. He asked the girl to become his knight. Falling to her knees, the maid responded by saying that an ordinary girl could not do such a thing. Suddenly, the prince added that he decided to promise to take the girl's family under his guardianship, but in return she must swear allegiance to him, concluded Gruhorn. He himself thought that if the girl could not control herself on her own, then he would personally take care of it. Looking at the young gentleman, Adelia Byrne asked him if he would really take her under his wing. In response, he told the boy that if the maid wanted, all her relatives would be brought to the capital, after which the girl began to swear allegiance to His Highness Indrian Leonberg. The boy was only glad to hear words about dedicating his life to him. When the green-eyed girl finished, the main character called her a good girl, after which he declared that from now on, Adelia Byrne would obey his orders unquestioningly. At the same time, a joyful expression was depicted on the girl's face, at the sight of which Gruhorn hoped that he had done the right thing by her. By this time, rumors began to circulate throughout the kingdom about Prince Indrian's renewed atrocities, such as the extortion of a knight's oath and the beating of aristocrats followed by imprisonment. And now His Highness has made a servant who has never held a sword in her hands his personal knight. Thus, the people concluded that the first prince was collecting a personal harem. The main character himself, having learned about the rumors, could not believe that overnight he was again considered a non-entity. The king himself could not contain his displeasure towards his son. The uncle, having learned about the rumors, asked his nephew if he remembered the bet. The brother noted how all the boy's actions were in the spirit of old Indrian. Returning to the protagonist, he wondered why rumors were spreading so quickly. Suddenly a maid appeared and told His Majesty about the queen's visit. When she found herself in front of her son, she immediately emphasized how he had returned to his former self. But then she unexpectedly added that this was even for the best. After all, when her son finds himself a wife at the parties, he will settle down and stop tormenting himself with stupidity. After which the woman, having given her word, promised to find Indriana a worthy bride. The main character himself, looking at the back of the departing queen, could not understand what was going on. After such a statement from his mother, Gruhorn decided to return to his new knight. Approaching Adelia, the young gentleman told her how she possessed special mana. Concentrating his mana, the blonde thought that even though the world had forgotten about the Iron Blood Marquise, but he still remembers that girl who became famous for her mighty strength. After all, even the traces of her deeds have not disappeared. Humanity has its own independence, and the style of the Marquise's sword is still alive in her descendants to this day. But the most important thing is that her heart continues to beat in her direct descendants. Thus, with the help of the main character, Adelia Bayern felt mana. Gruhorn successfully transferred mana to the girl sitting opposite. And finally, a system window appeared in front of the main character with the successful creation of the mana heart. Having finished the creation, the prince told the maid to train on her own from now on. Suddenly, the young gentleman who had just been standing fell to the floor, which made Adelia worried. The blonde himself thought how he didn't know about such a consequence of creating the pathetic mana heart. Looking at the rising milord, the girl asked why he was trying so hard for the sake of an insignificant servant. In response, the main character simply told the girl to go because everything was fine with him. Seeing that the maid was not going anywhere, Indrian asked what she was waiting for. Then Adelia Bayern bowed her head and swore allegiance to the young master. Hearing these words, the blonde asked his knight to always remember the oath. The girl concluded that she would always remember her loyalty to the prince. Gruhorn himself thought about how he hoped that the girl would fulfill this promise. A few days later, Charles told his lord about Bernardo Eli. They say the royal guard is holding him as a witness to the recent unrest, and it seems that no one is allowed to see him until the loan begins, which the boy thought about after hearing it. After which he asked if he needed to be present at the trial, to which the long-haired man reminded him that the royal family is not put on trial. Hearing about this advantage, the main character noted how pretty nice it was. But he himself liked how this situation was blown out of proportion. Then Indrian turned to the maid and asked how she was. After asking if the mana heart had been stabilized, the boy received a positive answer. Following this, the main character announced that from today on, Adelia would train with him. Without wasting any time, the prince told the girl to quickly change her clothes and wait for him on the landing. When the main character found himself on the street, a familiar voice asked him what he was doing. Having heard from his nephew about the warm-up, the dark-haired man added that he was interested in another person. He was curious about what the first prince's maid was doing at the moment. In response, the protagonist decided to remind his uncle how he was trying to make a knight out of the girl. Hearing this, Bale asked with displeasure. For the boy, the title of knight was an empty phrase. In response, Indrian asked since when the old man had been sticking his nose into other people's business. By this time, the girl who had arrived told how she had already finished. Having fallen from exhaustion, she added that she had successfully run 10 laps. Adelia, noticing the disgruntled man, wanted to apologize, but the boy who got ahead of her asked her to take the wooden sword. Having presented his blade, the blonde shared how he intended to teach the girl a basic stance today. After showing the starting stance, a split second later, Indrian demonstrated the swing. Having seen all the necessary movements, the girl began to try to get into a standing position. And then, a moment later, the blonde made a perfect swing, at the sight of which the man with the scar could not hide his surprised expression. Even the boy himself was amazed that the maid was able to repeat it the first time. Having finished with the movements, Adelia asked the young gentleman if everything was correct. Gruhorn concluded that if he relaxed, she would outshine him in no time. Remembering the devil, slave nature, the protagonist began to imagine the consequences, which can appear after the girl manages to overtake the owner in strength. Bale, watching the girl, noted the young talent in front of him. Hearing this sincerity, the blonde man, reminding himself of himself, turned to the old man, after which he added that he shouldn't even think about looking at this girl, to which the dark-haired man responded by asking what the boy could teach the child. After all, he himself picked up a real blade a couple of months ago, Bale reminded. Then he looked at his nephew with disdain and declared that he would not be able to reveal the blonde's potential. The main character himself thought that if the previous owner of the body had been in his place, he would have already escaped. But realizing that he was a different Gruhorn, he replied that if he couldn't handle the maid, then no one else could either. Because when he was still the Sword of Heroes, he drank the blood of the King of Giants. tasted the flesh of a dragon and many other powerful monsters. And ultimately, he is the one who helped the heroes rise in power. By this time, a system window appeared with the activation of half of the owner's soul, after which the first prince, using his aura, once again declared that Adelia belonged to him, and he hates it when someone even mentally touches what belongs to him. Lost in his thoughts, the protagonist felt his sense of reality slipping away. He feels neither strength nor life, only cold and pitch darkness. Looking at his previous body, the blonde realized that at this rate it was a weak body. The demonic soul of Gruhorn will absorb everything accumulated over time. Finding himself between the most different parts of his soul, the protagonist decided to end it. But then Gruhorn found himself in reality, where his uncle noted how one ordinary knight could save the lives of 10 soldiers. As for one outstanding knight, he can save a whole 100. And the girl opposite may have her own power to save a whole 1,000, Bale concluded. Indrian himself, listening to his uncle, thought how curious this was for him. After all, for the commander of the northern borders, Adelia turned out to be a tasty morsel. However, the blonde didn't care, but the dark-haired one was shocked to see such a reaction. Bale tried again to get his point across, but was interrupted by the girl's appeal. She also declared that her body and heart belonged only to His Highness. This means she won't be able to follow the Count's Wailerhard, the maid concluded. The boy was only glad that his knight had the slave nature trait. The main character then reminded his uncle how his goal was to lose weight. If the dark-haired man wants to continue visiting the palace, then good for him, but let him not interfere in his affairs. After listening to these words from his nephew, Bale still managed to calm down, even though he didn't want to. However, Count Wailerhard continued to come to the palace to look after Adelia. Although he couldn't do anything else, since the prince had forbidden him to even give advice, suddenly, one training day, the girl managed to activate the power on her own. The protagonist himself was shocked when he saw the real blade resonance. The blonde man, surprised, turned to the girl and noted how well she had done her job. And yet, Indrian understood that if this continued, she would outsmart him. The dark-haired man approached and asked the boy if he had really taught Adelia the heart of mana. Having received a positive answer, he began to call the boy a fool with displeasure. In response to this, the first prince himself, looking coldly at his uncle, told him to leave. Blue-eyed at one time decided to continue. He thought that the kid had ruined everything. Passing by Carl, the boy told him to show the dark-haired man the way. Then Bale turned around abruptly and decided to leave the area on his own, after which the main character, without even looking at his departing uncle, thought about his own. Hearing the Count's words, the girl asked the gentleman if it was true that she had learned a cheap trick, to which Indrian responded negatively and told the maid to cling to the old man's words. But even after these words, the green-eyed girl asked why the Count had such an opinion. The blonde declared that this man knew nothing, just like everyone else of that era. After all, if they had remembered what the heart of mana was capable of, they would not have thrown it into the void of centuries. Heading in the opposite direction, Gruhorn concluded that Adelia would soon understand the true power of the mana heart. The next day, a sword was unexpectedly thrust into the ground next to the main character. It was Bale, at the sight of which the boys shared, as he already thought he would never see again. Then the dark-haired man declared that he would accept the boy's methods if he could move him half a step. Grabbing the wooden sword, the blonde asked if his uncle remembered that they had bet on a wish, to which the blue-eyed man assured the prince that if he lost, he would do anything he wanted. The boy himself was only glad to get a chance to get what he wanted, and just a moment later he was next to the enemy, swinging his sword. Seeing the swing, Bale shared how he was amused by how the boy was aiming for the neck from the very beginning. He also noticed that today the blonde was as cunning as ever. After these words, a multitude of blows were aimed at the dark-haired man, which he successfully dodged. One of the boy's treacherous swings even had to be blocked with a sword. Count Wailerhard crossed his blades and asked his opponent if he could show him anything else. And a second later, Indrian, finding himself under pressure from the enemy, decided to jump back. The blue-eyed man himself assumed that the boy was already intending to surrender. The boy stood up and said in response that this would not happen, but he himself thought how irritating the man opposite him was. Still, Gruhorn understood how strong Bale was. He was just waiting for his mana to be released. Then the blonde man, having turned to his opponent, asked him if it wasn't strange. Hearing his nephew's words, the dark-haired man did not understand what they were talking about. Then Indrian continued, 400 years ago, the Knights of the Heart of Mana performed incredible feats. However, as soon as one more or less useful technology appeared, everything changed dramatically. Then all the arts of the great knights were equated with trash, despite their importance. Everyone began to think that the mana chain technique was a much more powerful way to control the flow than the mana heart. After hearing this, Bale asked his opponent if he disagreed. In response, the protagonist added that all techniques are different and depend on the swordsman. Then the blonde asked his uncle if he knew about the Anthem of Fighting Spirit. Hearing about it, Count Wallerhard reminded him how to cross swords and not discuss beautiful fairy tales. Smiling, Indrian shared how he expected his uncle to say that. After all, he called the mana heart a crude technique for every non-entity. The dark-haired man asked the boy if he was stalling for time, to which he received a negative answer. Taking a step, the first prince declared that the path taken by a knight becomes an achievement. Closing his eyes, the protagonist began to focus his mana and radiate it throughout his body. Bale, watching this strange picture, tried to understand what the boy wanted to achieve. By this time, a system window appeared with a chant of the 100 victories won over the 20 students dreaming of becoming knights. Achievement is carved into the heart, and the carved achievement becomes the anthem of the fighting spirit. Thus, the Anthem of Fighting Spirit was created to the joy of the protagonist. Because although it was an ordinary small achievement, it had been accumulated over the last 6 months. At one time, Bale, looking at the boy, declared that nothing would help him. After all, while his opponent possesses the mana heart, it is impossible for him to defeat the chain. The protagonist, not intending to listen to the enemy, rushed into attack. In a mere moment, the two wooden swords crossed again, producing a dull sound. Gruhorn knew his uncle's words were true, as the chain's mana was causing the energy to flow backwards, destroying the mana heart. The dark-haired man counterattacked and emphasized how the boy's stubbornness needed to be given its due. Realizing the opponent's strength, the protagonist concluded that it would not be so easy. Even though he managed to fight 100 battles and withstand the onslaught of chain mana 1,000 times. The force created to fight the Knight of Chains and Kolya has immense power. Having dealt another blow, Gruhorn once again recalled everything he had experienced over the past months. And with these thoughts, the boy decided to use the Anthem of Duels. Holding the wooden sword in front of him, the blonde decided to give it a try. To begin with, he reduced his distance from his opponent, thereby crossing weapons. Then Indrian began to deliver a series of blows, but Bale had no intention of giving in. The man with the scar himself wondered how the kid had managed to hold out for so long. And in a moment, the first prince found himself again at a distance from his uncle. Looking at the boy, the count shared his surprise out loud that the blonde was still standing on his feet. Hearing again how mana hearts come in different varieties, he called his nephew arrogant. Following this, a powerful blow was directed towards the main character, which he tried to dodge. But ultimately, Indrian was sent into the nearest wall, raising dust. Bale himself stated that he will not play anymore, but the fact that the boy is still standing is already commendable. Gruhorn thought, as expected, a regular rank 1 fighting spirit hymn wouldn't be enough. When the main character began to get up, he decided to tell a story. How 400 years ago the knights made the cancerous mistake of the times. They left no enemies for their descendants, declared the first prince. At first, the knowledge was passed down intact, sword techniques, the true method of tempering the heart, and the shining hymn of the fighting spirit. But time covered all these great achievements of mankind with dust, and eventually consigned them to oblivion. Stories of mighty dragons and giant kings that no one has ever seen. And in the end, all this turned into ridiculous stories created by the new generation. Of course, new hymns were created, but their limit was victory over 10 knights. These were hymns created only for battles. They were far from mythical or heroic level. They couldn't resist the new influence, the mana chain, and with such techniques you can't get very far. In response, the dark-haired man shared how he had long since stopped understanding the boy's nonsense. Bale Wellerhard, an arrogant and foolish knight according to the first prince. Focusing his mana, the main character declared that it was high time for everyone to know how great a treasure has been lost due to human error. But since people don't know, he will enlighten them, concluded the main character. He added that no famous blade could cut through dragon scales. And drink his hot blood, said the prince, surrounding himself with energy. Thus, a system window appeared in front of Gruhorn with the opportunity to receive the hymn of the true dragon fighter. But the current characteristics did not correspond to the rank of this ability, which is why the boy felt pain throughout his body. As a result, the smallest part of the anthem was activated to protect one's own body, after which, in a split second, Indrian appeared in front of his enemy, raising his blade to strike. When the dark-haired man began to take the attack, he was struck by surprise. He also noted that at this rate his body would be devoured by the boy. Following this, Baal Valorhard resorted to using Mana Chain. Then, in the place where the duo had once been, an explosion thundered. Suddenly, from the raised dust, His Majesty appeared, having flown several meters. Looking at his uncle, Indrian asked why he had resorted to using the 4 chains. Hearing these words, the dark-haired man was amazed and thought about his own. When Baal Valorhard looked at his blade, he saw only a broken piece of wood. He couldn't believe that the Mana Heart was able to resist the Mana Chains. Following this, the protagonist turned to Count Baal opposite, after which the boy declared that the opponent had lost, which he could not believe. Finding himself in his mind, the protagonist saw in front of him his previous blade shell covered in blood. And a moment later, Indrian woke up. It was just a terrible dream. Suddenly, the boy felt a brutal pain in his chest, causing him to grab his shirt. He was sweating and was very dissatisfied with the after effects of using the anthem. This was the price he paid for forcibly unleashing the power of this powerful ability. After all, the hymn of the true dragon fighter belongs to mythical techniques. Although the boy's body could barely withstand the pressure, the risk was worth it. And yet, this is the first hymn of fighting spirit that Gruhorn has woven himself. He achieved this result with the help of hundreds of battles and thousands of waves of enemies. Thus, a system window with an increase in the anthem rank appeared in front of the main character. While the blonde was rejoicing at his success, a maid entered his chambers, greeting His Majesty. Without hiding the joy on her face, the girl screamed as the young gentleman woke up. She also told how after the duel there was complete chaos. She had never seen the queen so angry. Looking at the blonde's happy face, Adelia told how the count asked her to tell him something. When the first prince came to his senses, hearing these words, Gruhorn himself was all ears. But suddenly he interrupted the maid and said that he didn't want to know yet. After all, he's going to rest a little more if he has such an opportunity. If the spirit damaged by excessive use of the anthem is not properly restored, it will pay with its life. Reality will be layered on top of memories of the past, turning into a kaleidoscope of nightmare. And at some point, the line between them will simply disappear without a trace. And in the end, the main character will go crazy and will forever relive the moments of battles in a consciousness shattered into millions of fragments. Remembering his past nightmare, Gruhorn did not want to find himself in the blade's body again. Without wasting any time, the boy decided to take care of his knight, first telling him about her ancestor. And since she is a descendant of Bayern, she should be able to inherit Agnes's anthem of fighting spirit, the boy noted. After listening to the prince, the girl told how she did not know that her ancestor was so great. The blonde added that to gain her abilities, she would need to become an order of magnitude stronger. Suddenly, he asked Adelia what she wanted to achieve on her path of the sword. Hearing this question, the green-eyed girl thought about the time in surprise, after which she lowered her gaze and hesitated greatly because she did not know what to wish for. When the girl had an idea, she began to scream shyly. In response to this, the blonde said that if she didn't know how to formulate it, then let her say it later. And then Adelia declared that she wanted only one thing, to become His Majesty's sword. Hearing these words, the main character was, to put it mildly, surprised, because he did not expect such an answer. Some hymns may begin with loud blasts of a war horn, hearing which, others begin with the first step on the plane, and some stories begin with a sincere oath that the boy now saw before him. Returning to reality, Adelia began her vow to the young master, dedicating herself entirely to him. Indrian himself, feeling a surge of energy, immediately realized that this was the hymn of Adelia's fighting spirit. Thus, a system window appeared in front of the boy with the possibility of creating a new anthem. The boy received the hymn of fighting spirit of the ordinary rank, the hymn of dominance. It is not a combat technique, but an oath of allegiance that binds souls. Looking at the green-eyed Gruhorn, I couldn't believe that one day the descendant of the Iron Blood Marquise would compose a hymn of this type. Noticing the radiating energy, he concluded that this was an unexpected help. And all because the hymn of submission is currently aimed at the main character. Adelia's increased strength would also benefit the young master, for which he was very grateful. Without hiding his thoughts, the first prince happily thanked the girl. But still, Indrian did not yet know what exactly that benefit would be. Thus, several long days passed since the formation of the anthem. Having sat down in his chair, my lord, looking ahead, was very dissatisfied. Karl and Adelia, standing nearby, were of the same opinion as their master. A female voice asked her son if everything was okay, to which Indrian replied positively. Looking at the queen, he concluded that it was much easier for him to communicate with them. Some hate his body, but Gruhorn feels uneasy with those who loved his previous owner so much. Unexpectedly, the mother assumed that the boy was offended by his uncle. But he didn't wish him any harm, so if his son had any bad feelings, then let him let it go, the dark-haired woman asked. In response, the protagonist said that everything was fine, but the queen could not believe that he was not angry after everything he had been through. Gruhorn himself thought about how he had been able to deal one blow that had managed to destroy his uncle's pride. It must be hard for him to bear what he showed in that fight, the blonde thought. And if anyone is having a hard time, it's Bale Whalerhard, because a wormhole has appeared in his heart. If he has enough strength, he will make a breakthrough, but if not, he will lose even the skill he has now. This means that now everything depends on how the uncle perceives his loss. The queen told how her brother had spent his whole life with the sword and not with people, and that was why he could be so rude. And yet, lately it seemed that the dark-haired one was proud of his nephew, because he personally defended the boy in front of the king. The main character was released from house arrest earlier, only with the help of Bale. But as soon as he lost his vigilance, disaster struck and the count had to endure it hard. Gruhorn himself could not understand why this man would try so hard for him. The next day, a scientist named Niccolò Marchiadel came to see the first prince. Understanding why the bespectacled protagonist was here, he already began to mentally refuse. Then he began to tumble around on the floor and share his opinion about how he didn't want to study. In response, the old man asked, "What if a person does not want to learn? How is he different from an animal?" which made the boy angry. Having sat down, the protagonist declared that he already knew everything he needed. Having listened to all the indignation of the young gentleman, he said that he would not teach him anyway. But he would still like to discuss a couple of topics to find out how good the prince's knowledge was. The main character was not going to refuse such an offer. He thought it was quite good. Thus, after some time, Indrian ardently agreed with the opinion of Niccolò Marchiadelli. The blonde believed that if he gave in, the people around him would sit on his neck. Handing over the book, the old man assured his interlocutor that he would like it. It describes the relationship between the ruler and his subjects, considering contracts and transactions between them. Having read it carefully, the boy agreed that the meaning of all the sentences was clear. And after some time, the main character did not notice how evening had come. Having said goodbye to the young gentleman, Niccolò Marchiadel intended to continue the discussion tomorrow. When Gruhorn thought about it, he suddenly realized that this was a lesson. Thinking about the scientist, the main character noted how cunning and smart he was. The bespectacled man himself was thinking about how the rumors circulating about the prince turned out to be untrue. After some time, Indrian, lying on the bed, did not know what to do. Tossing and turning all over the bed, he thought about how without training there was nothing at all to do. Unexpectedly, my lord learned from the maid how Count Whalerhard came to him. Without thinking twice, he told Adelia to, of course, let the guest in. While waiting for Uncle Indrian to appear, he noted how several days had passed since their duel. And a few minutes later, the man with the scar showed up, but the blue-eyed man was immersed in his thoughts. Seeing his uncle's face, the prince assumed that he still hadn't overcome his inner demon. At that very moment, Bale Whalerhard asked the protagonist for forgiveness, which he didn't expect at all because for him, his uncle had always been an arrogant knight. The dark-haired man added that he had broken his oath by wounding his nephew. Gruhorn himself was thinking about how he had fallen ill because of his own mistake with the dragon fighter's hymn. In addition, the boy remembered how the queen had said that her brother also had a hard time. Returning to the present, Bale Whalerhard asked the boy what he wanted. He also added that he was ready to give his own hand, which the blonde was not very happy about. Gruhorn couldn't believe that a man who had once been a master of the sword had become so weak because his technique wasn't perfect. After which the main character decided to agree and take advantage of the wish. He shared with his uncle how he wanted to go on a trip, and his uncle had to let him go. The dark-haired man himself recalled with surprise how the prince's house arrest was lifted. Then the boy added that he wanted his trip to be long and preferably outside the capital. Hearing such a request, the man with the scar looked at his nephew and thought, after which he said that they would have to agree on a schedule because of the upcoming banquet, and my lord agreed with this. Turning around, Bale assured the boy that he would let him know when everything was ready. Carl, standing behind him, looked thoughtfully at his young master. Feeling someone's gaze, Indrian asked the long-haired man why he was looking like that. The knight shared how unexpected it all was, because he had assumed that the prince would demand something crazy. After all, Count Whalerhard broke his word, and it would be bad to let such an opportunity go. to which Indrian replied that seeing how the stubborn old man was grieving, he felt sorry for him. Then the long-haired man laughed, which made the main character very unhappy. A maid unexpectedly entered and addressed His Majesty, wanting to tell him something. She also told how the letter arrived, which the gentleman had been waiting for a long time. Upon opening it, Gruhorn immediately realized that the sender was his first knight. The beauty told in it how she recently achieved a small success. "And it looks like she will soon be able to visit the first prince," concluded Avan Kurgayan. Reading the letter, Indrian was only glad because this news came just in time for him. 5 days later, Bale sent the long-awaited news, and 2 days later, the prince set out on his journey. Almost jumping out of the carriage, the boy wanted to know where they were going. In response, the man with the scar told the protagonist to sit still. Realizing that Indrian would not back down, Bale still decided to tell him. Ellen County is the main supplier of weapons to the royal court. There are high-quality mines with high-quality iron ore. Subsequently, it is used by the Blacksmiths Guild for processing. In addition, the dark-haired man said that more than half of the royal arsenal came from Ellen. Thinking about his progress in fencing, Gruhorn wanted to acquire his own blade. One day he just wanted to take a good sword from the royal armory, but the king, threatening the knight, forbade it. Right there in the carriage, the blue-eyed man realized that this was due to a mistake by the previous owner. And given this, in order to get the weapon, the boy needs to look for it outside the palace. Looking at his uncle, the prince noted that although he looked stern, he was actually caring. Thus began the 20-day journey of the protagonist. The journey itself involves a short stop in Ellen County, 3 days' journey from the capital, then a visit to Iron Line Castle, another 2 days' journey away. It was there that Indrian and his entourage intended to rest before returning to the capital. Returning to the main character, he thought with boredom about how he had already been on the road for 3 days. The fellow traveler, on the contrary, is the very idea of despondency that answers only yes or no. The main character didn't like all this at all, which made him sigh heavily. Realizing that he had a lot of time, the boy decided to test his mana heart. Due to the attack after the dragon fighter's hymn, it was completely empty. But it was time to replenish it, Gruhorn concluded, focusing his mana. Plunged into the void, he listened and felt the trembling and shaking of the carriage. A cool breeze blows outside and occasionally enters the carriage. The voices of the escort knights, who communicate with each other on various topics. Listening to all this, the main character began to collect grains of mana, collecting them inside himself, after which the collected mana was sent to the empty heart, wanting to fill it. When the boy opened his eyes while in the space of the heart, he was amazed by something. He couldn't understand how it had ever managed to grow to such a size. At that very moment, a system window appeared with the accomplishment of an incredible feat beyond one's capabilities, due to which a fragment of colossal will was obtained. These were the very consequences of the forced use of the dragon fighter's hymn. That attempt reflected on Indrian's body, causing the mana heart to increase in size. The body's constitution was also significantly expanded and changed, making it capable of withstanding much more mana. Thus, the protagonist reached the rank of sword expert, and the connection with the source improved. Some of the restrictions were lifted. The third eye's power has been significantly strengthened several times. At this time, Adelia, seeing the strangeness around the prince, turned to him. Gruhorn himself was delighted to realize that he had become much stronger after receiving his promotion. After some time, the first prince and his people were able to reach Ellen County. The man who presented himself tried to express in words what an honor it was for him to meet His Majesty. The man in the red robe bowed his head and introduced himself as Edgar, while the man next to him was called Torrance. The man assumed that the road was long and wanted to accompany the gentleman to his quarters. Having entered the huge building, the boy began to look around thoughtfully. He also noted how Ellen's mansion was truly filled with all sorts of hardware. But this was just low-grade junk in the opinion of the main character. Apparently, Indrian realized that it would not be easy for him to find what he needed here. Without intending to delay, the prince asked Edgar if it was true that the Blacksmiths Guild was located on his territory. Having received a positive answer at the same second, Gruhorn said that he wanted to take a look around there. Heading towards the guild, the aristocrat explained how blacksmiths were rude and stubborn. When work is in full swing, they can even ignore their own lord. Entering inside, the main character was amazed by everything he saw in front of him. Inside the guild, work was in full swing. The temperature was so high that it could have made you sick. What most struck the young gentleman was the ringing of hammers filling the air. Looking at Indrian, who was moving forward, the aristocrat tried to address him. But the boy, feeling the roaring flames and the hissing of the furs, moved only forward. Yet, amidst all this, one exceptionally clear sound could be heard. Looking at the skilled blacksmith, the protagonist felt a rather familiar feeling. This was his first memory, when he was still an ordinary sword. Suddenly, the boy was brought out of these thoughts by the appearance of a handkerchief. The maid, looking at her master, told how he was completely soaked. The man who appeared, causing all the blacksmiths to stop, greeted His Highness. The aristocrat introduced the man as the guild leader named Zaxxon. But still, among all the workers, there was one who did not want to stop his work. Saxon ordered him to immediately drop the hammer and bow to the young master. In response, the main character covered the mustachioed man's mouth with his own hand, forcing him to remain silent. Then he asked, why do something he had not even intended to ask for? With these words, the blonde emphasized how quickly the iron would cool down. Realizing that they could continue working, the blacksmiths rushed to their furnaces. The main character, in the midst of all the commotion, stood and watched only one person. Behind the old man, who, time after time, delivered precise blows to the hot iron. Feeling a strange feeling, Gruhorn wondered what this was. After leaving the workshop, Edgar told how the old man had been forging swords and immediately melting them down for the last 6 months. Hearing this, the main character attributed everything to marriage. But the aristocrat himself did not know. There are rumors surrounding this blacksmith and how every blade he forges is a masterpiece. Even the blades that Edgar saw seemed flawless to him, but they were still melted down. Moreover, the old man had hardly slept for the last month, but had been working all the time. He is no longer young, so everyone around him is seriously worried about him. Several days passed since then. The prince came to the forge at dawn and left late at night. At one time, that old man simply continued to work, not paying anyone any attention. The prince watched silently as the blacksmith tried to create his creation. Despite the general tension caused by rumors about the first prince's visit, it was even surprising that his arrival was quite quiet. And so, after a long time, the day of departure came, and the boy spent the day as usual. But in the end, Indrian let out a heavy sigh and realized that he would not be able to see the result. Edgar was watching all this, and had not taken his eyes off the gentleman since the day he arrived. At the same time, the aristocrat saw how deeply disappointed His Majesty was. Not daring to stay any longer, the protagonist told his companions to go. The Count himself also gave in to sadness, as did the guest who had come to visit him. He hoped that the prince would at least catch a glimpse of the master's completed sword. But then, to the protagonist's surprise, Edgar arrived and told him how the master managed to complete his creation. Rushing forward, Indrian, out of breath, finally saw the blacksmith in front of him. The old man, standing with his brainchild, looked at the shimmering rays of the sun on the blade, after which, upon seeing the first prince, he bowed his head and showed his sword. Turning to the man opposite, the blacksmith decided to dedicate his creation to him. Slowly reaching for the magnificent weapon, the protagonist could not hide his emotions. Edgar, who was standing behind, was more amazed by this event than the prince himself. At one time, the old man began to tell how to obtain a first-class creation. First, you need to heat the metal until it becomes like the rising sun and cool it until the steel acquires a crimson hue, like the king's robe. And if everything is done correctly, then a sword will be born, imbued with the spirit of the sun and having a royal stature. Looking at his own reflection on the weapon, Indrian asked the creator if the blade had a name. Then the old man, dripping with sweat, named the sword. It was called Twilight. In response to this, the boy asked the following question: "What exactly is this twilight?" To which the white-haired man said that for him they were pre-sunset, and for His Majesty they were pre-dawn, to which the protagonist noted that for a blacksmith, the old man was a very poetic person. The old man himself, out of breath and looking at the ground, was very happy about something. Following this, he tried to fall from exhaustion, but the boy managed to catch the blacksmith. Trying to lift the man, the blonde ordered to tell his uncle that they would be staying for one night. By nightfall, the main character found himself in a tent with a blacksmith who was feeling unwell. He shared how, at the moment when the prince stood behind him, the sword itself took shape, as if by the will of fate. Blade chose his birthday on his own, and hearing these words, the boy smiled. Suddenly, the main character bowed his head and decided to whisper something to the old man. The white-haired man himself was amazed after hearing this, looking at the boy. Realizing who the person next to him was, the man screamed. But then he laughed, and told how he now began to understand everything. Then the blacksmith turned to his majesty and asked him to support the sword. Without thinking twice, Indrian placed the heavy blade into his interlocutor's trembling hand. The white-haired man, looking into the void, began to pray to God for this blade. "He became as great as his majesty," concluded the old blacksmith. In response, the boy, clasping the hand holding the sword, declared that it would be so. After this, the great creator of no less great creations closed his eyes forever. The next day, Count Edgar showed a beautiful box with a sword. He assumed that the gentleman would be uncomfortable fighting with that blacksmith's sword, and the aristocrat just happens to have a magic blade, which he wanted to present to the prince, but in exchange. When Edgar wanted to finish his sentence, the blonde didn't let him, noting the good quality of the weapon. Having laid down the second sword, the protagonist thanked the aristocrat for the gift. After praising Ellen's family's devotion to the royal family, Indrian said goodbye. Edgar himself wanted to exchange the great blacksmith's blade for a magic sword, but it didn't work out. After such a long visit, the boy and his people moved on. Indrian approached the dark-haired man and asked what was bothering him. The boy also noted that he had not seen his uncle in the county at all, to which he said that he had a personal mission from the king. Hearing this, the protagonist now realized that this trip was beneficial to everyone. Bale then explained how he planned to be at the Iron Lion's castle by nightfall. But then Gruhorn shared with the man opposite how he couldn't ride a horse. The man with the scar was, to put it mildly, shocked by this statement. Seeing the surprised expressions on their faces hidden under the helmets, the blonde wondered how he hadn't been trained to do this as a blade. The road to the Iron Lion Castle was filled with a variety of interesting events. But even with all the troubles, the main character did not intend to give up. And in the end, the first prince, tired from his eventful journey, still managed to reach the castle. Although they didn't make it in half a day as they had planned, they still got there within a day. Upon arrival, a man named York immediately appeared with knights. Listening to the greeting of the Iron Lions, the boy was amazed at such diligence. But then, among all the knights, the main character noticed his own. Gruhorn walked forward and greeted Arwen. The girl herself, bowing her head with all honors, also greeted the gentleman. The dark-haired girl told how she counted the days waiting for the prince's arrival. At this time, Indrian noticed looks filled with envy towards the dark-haired girl. To the boy's surprise, he felt Adelia's intense gaze. Realizing how hostility towards the owner could provoke the girl, Indrian turned to her. Having returned to her previous state, the green-eyed girl bowed her head before the prince. Returning to Arwen, His Majesty told her to follow him. With a smirk on his face, the blonde noted how they had a lot to discuss. And after some time, Gruhorn changed his clothes and prepared for the upcoming training. He wanted to see the skill of the Iron Lions, who are called the best in the kingdom. When the boy asked who his first opponent would be, the crowd began to look around. Not finding an opponent, the boy asked the knights if they were afraid of his status, after which the blonde swore on Leonberg's behalf that he would not hold anyone responsible for the outcome of the fight. Once again, finding no takers, the blonde noted how the famous Iron Lions turned out to be just kittens. Immediately after these words, the first candidate appeared, named Dale from the Dennant clan. He also shared how he lacks the skills to demonstrate the Iron Lion style. Yet he was the first to dare to oppose His Majesty in the competition. In response, the main character was only glad that the enemy had appeared. The red-haired man, not intending to wait, rushed towards his opponent with a wooden sword at the ready. The boy himself, using the heart of mana, began a confrontation with the enemy's mana chain. In a mere moment, Dale of the Dennant clan was defeated by the protagonist. Indrian, having gotten into the swing of things, wanted to begin the next duel with the knight. At the time, the Iron Lions, looking at the defeated member, could not hide their surprise. Gruhorn's next opponent was Paul Rodheim, who told how he managed to end up in his third year one year. But even such a man turned out to be no match for the main character's fencing strength. Following this one-sided duel, another 10 of the same kind took place. Looking at the crowd of defeated opponents, the blonde was not very happy. Tom wanted to fight with real knights who possessed sufficient strength. Thinking about this, Gruhorn turned to Arwen, which surprised the girl with such suddenness. The prince himself told how when he was getting ready to go back, he would take the dark-haired girl. Hearing these words, the girl bowed her head and obeyed the master's words. Unexpectedly, to the boy's delight, another candidate for opponent appeared. Standing in front of the prince, the white-haired man decided to propose a small argument. Without letting the knight finish his sentence, the protagonist refused. He, with a displeased look, declared that Arwen was not a trophy. Having ordered Carl to bring the sword, Indrian suggested putting something else on the line. For example, if the long-haired one defeats him, he will be able to get this blade. The dark-haired woman standing nearby was amazed by such generosity. The potential enemy himself was of the same opinion as Arwen. Rushing to the gentleman, the girl tried to offer her candidacy for a duel but was immediately refused. The blonde added that the dark-haired one was 1,000 times more valuable than any weapon. Shaggy, introducing himself as Dunham of the Fahrenheit clan, was only too happy to agree to such a proposal. Thus, the main character's opponent turned out to be the almost owner of 3 chains. To which the boy responded by noting how his opponent was a recent owner of a double chain. Having shown his blade, the long-haired man said that it was the 17th work of the craftsman known as the Master of Swords, and if the gentleman wins with fashion, he will receive this very weapon. In response, Gruhorn explained how he, too, was the owner of this master's blade. This sword is the 100th creation of the genius blacksmith from the Blacksmith's Guild. The long-haired one shared how he hadn't heard that the Master of Swords had created the 100th weapon, to which the main character told how this sword was forged for him several days ago. Noting the poorly chosen path of the sword of the young master, Dunham decided to demonstrate true style. The boy was amused by how the long-haired man dared to call him Mana Heart. The prince explained out loud how this technique was not his, but came from the depths of centuries. Adelia, watching her master, was mesmerized by the spectacle. Indrian stated that he only needed this type of technology from his people. Turning to the girl standing next to him, the main character told her to watch carefully, after which, an aura appeared around the first prince, turning into the form of a swordsman hero. Adelia must watch him for one reason, to follow the same path. Without wasting any time, the maid began to repeat after her young master, after which she declared that she would definitely follow this path no matter what. At this time, Bale Valorhard was chatting with York over a cup of tea, discussing his 4th visit to the Iron Lion's castle. The man, on the contrary, told how the 4th prince is not interested in the throne, which is why he does not come here. The 3rd and 5th arrived while the 1st was under surveillance due to an incident. Even the 2nd prince had recently dropped by, and no matter how much notoriety there was, it could not be denied that the 1st prince was the rightful heir to the throne. And since things have come to this, the blame lies with the dark-haired one, York declared. After all, if the commander of the 3rd Corps had supported the 1st prince even a little, His Highness would not have found himself in such isolation. York wondered why Bale had only started acting like a guardian now after so much time. Listening to these words, the dark-haired man agreed that he had once truly renounced the boy when he was a tyrant. One day, when Bale was scolding him for drugging himself with a vile potion, the 1st prince rushed at his own uncle with his blade at the ready. Then Bale, deeply disappointed, returned to the north, and his nephew sent him a letter with wine, after which the man with the scar, using his strength, drank cheap poison. By burning his dark-haired one with him, he burned all the pitiful remnants of family feelings. However, the boy who seemed hopeless to his uncle changed dramatically. The 1st prince endured all the grueling training and grew stronger every day. At this time, York recalled how his interlocutor had once said that Indrian should not become king. Now the man realized how his nephew was completely different from what he had been in the past. With these thoughts in mind, Bale asked the man across from him to give the boy a chance, at least so that he would be on equal terms with the other princes. After which, the dark-haired man bowed his head and once again asked York to help him. Listening to Count Weilerhard, the brown-haired man shared that he didn't understand one thing: who had changed, the 1st prince or Bale. Suddenly, a knight appeared and turned to his lordship Valabin for attention. The reason was the very 1st prince who had recently appeared, which astonished the duo. Heading towards the protagonist, York shared that there was no point in worrying him. Dunham knew his limits. Even in a duel with real swords, he is unlikely to maim a member of the royal family. In response, Bale noted how his interlocutor should worry about the knight, not the boy. Hearing such a statement, the brown-haired man found himself in a state of confusion and called the dark-haired man strange. When the duo arrived at the place, they saw a long-haired man flying in front of them. Thus, the main character managed to win again to the joyful cries of the others. York, seeing this whole picture, asked himself only one question: what happened? Bale reminded him that he had said that he needed to worry about his knight. In this battle, the protagonist recalled how his uncle said that a true knight begins with 2 chains. Crossing blades, Indrian realized that this was not an exaggeration. because even with the current anthem, it would be difficult to win. But still, Gruhoran understood that he could not use the Dragon Fighter's hymn against an ordinary knight. With this thought in mind, the boy decided to resort to using hyper-concentration. Having focused his mana into the heart, the protagonist prepared to receive the enemy's attack. As he rushed forward with his sword, the blonde felt a familiar feeling, just like the day lightning struck. After the boy's lunge, the opponent was sent back several meters. Then the next enemy appeared, whom Indrian no longer heard. Fully concentrating on the fights, the blonde rushed ahead. Having not achieved the desired result the first time, Indrian tried again, and thus the main character was able to defeat 3 more opponents. After some time, when evening had already arrived, there were no more volunteers for the duel. The knights standing nearby began to praise the honor of His Majesty the First Prince. The boy himself thought that, having stood against 1,000 waves in 100 battles, he would not falter even before the 9th wave. At the same time, a system window appeared in front of the boy with the appearance of a new stanza in the Anthem of Fighting Spirit. These were a few words, only now he rises, burning the sword. The Anthem of Duel has also been upgraded to a new rank of Outstanding, giving more power to its owner. Seeing a multitude of system windows in front of him, the main character was delighted. But at that very moment, the first prince fell to the ground due to lack of strength. The knight ran up and asked the boy if he was okay, after which he expressed universal respect for the victory won by His Highness. Following this, all the knights who had gathered nearby began to praise the first prince. Gruhorn himself couldn't understand what was happening, because recently all these people were ready to tear him apart. At this time, York noted how simple all the people present were by nature. The victory of the protagonist stirred their blood like nothing else. Bale, approaching the boy and noting his face, assumed that he expected to anger the knights. But in the end, a dignified defeat turned out to be more valuable than a dirty victory. The knights themselves noted how difficult it would still be for Dunham, since he would have to give up his sword. Lost in thought, Gruhorn thought about how all his knowledge had been forgotten and lost along with the mana heart. But still, something has remained unchanged throughout all these centuries. The ability to accept defeat with dignity and respect the strong is the true knightly spirit. After some time, the day came for the excursion to continue on its route. Holding his horse, the protagonist wished to see each other again in the future. An earl named York bowed his head and shared how he would pray for the health of the prince. Unexpectedly, the protagonist asked Valabin to keep everything that happened here a secret. In response, the man asked whether it would not be more profitable for the boy to make this public. Then Indrian, remembering one person, told how there was someone with whom he wanted to play a little. Towards evening, the first prince's people decided to stop their journey and spend the night in a vacant lot. Karl approached the blonde and said that he wanted to look around for safety. Turning around, Gruhorn saw how Arwen lowered her gaze and thought that she would soon get used to it. With these thoughts, the blonde headed to the tent and decided to rest. Adelia greeted the young gentleman who was standing in front of her. Remembering how he made a knight out of this girl, the boy could not understand why she was behaving like an ordinary servant. Seeing His Highness's dissatisfied face, the girl tried to find out. Laying down on the bed, Indrian responded by telling the girl not to pay attention and go. Looking at the ceiling, the protagonist thought about the fact that the Iron Lions were not what he expected. Most rank-and-file knights couldn't wield a sword better than a B rank, and in the past, people only reached the intermediate level after a lifetime of hellish training. And now such people become experts by the age of 20 or 30. Although the level of superhumans has fallen immeasurably, the level of ordinary people has risen sharply. And yet, it's all thanks to the mana chains, the protagonist concluded, standing up abruptly. His uncle is someone who in the past could have made a move on transcendence. That's why the boy was so upset that he gave up this opportunity. However, in this era, it is impossible to achieve anything beyond the exceptional level. Because of which, ultimately, it all comes down to the passage of time. Gruhorn, admitting how little he knows this era, decided to start studying from the very beginning. A voice that suddenly appeared noted the nephew's good mood. Bale added that if the boy puts in all the effort, he will be able to fulfill his dream. Seeing the confusion on Indrian's face, he explained that if other princes had been in his place, they would not have been able to get along so easily with the lions. It was a very wise decision, Ian, the scarred man concluded. Hearing this form of his own name, the blonde could not understand what had happened to his uncle. Then the man with the scar asked the prince if he remembered the bet. If we are talking about defeating the third prince, then yes, Indrian shared. At one time, The man recalled how they argued about winning against any knight with a double chain. Realizing that the boy had fulfilled his promise, Bale decided to keep it. Looking at the approaching dark-haired Gruhorn, I didn't understand what he wanted to do. The uncle himself introduced himself by his own name and stated his position in the kingdom. Officially declares support for the first prince, Indrian Leonberg. Now the main character understood why his uncle's attitude towards him had changed. He couldn't understand when he said that he wanted to take the royal throne. This statement from my uncle eventually had the effect of a bomb exploding. The crowd that surrounded the first prince expressed its sincere congratulations. The newly arrived royal knights and soldiers almost danced with joy. And the servants sent from the palace fussed around the boy all the time. And thus the first prince suddenly found himself at the center of all the discussions. Unable to bear this, the blonde ordered everyone to be sent back immediately. Carl told that the people who arrived would not leave, because they were here by royal decree. Then the main character asked to remove these people from his sight because they were bothering him. Having sat down, the boy breathed a sigh of relief when all the extra people left the room. But then this deathly silence was broken by the door suddenly opening. It was the third prince, upon seeing whom Indrian asked what he wanted. Jillian was angry that his brother was secretly learning fencing from Valorhard. In response, the protagonist asked who learned what from whom, which angered the third prince even more. Pointing his finger at the boy, Jillian declared that he would pay dearly for this deception. Gruhorn himself was thinking about how he didn't need the throne, so why did he need these problems? Returning to that day of personal conversations between uncle and nephew, Indrian shared how he does not intend to become king. Asking the man across from him why he started all this, the blonde received a smirk, after which the dark-haired man reminded how the county of Valorhard is the kingdom's shield from monsters. And as long as the royal family remembers the severity of winter, nothing bad will happen to his family. In response, the first prince shared that he was always calm anyway. And then Bale asked his nephew if he knew what the fate of the firstborn who did not inherit the throne would be. The situation will not change no matter how much Indrian buries his head in the sand. But he must remember, the birthright will only disappear with him, the man concluded as he left. Left alone, Gruhorn thought about how no matter how much they asked him, he would not change his mind. Because all he needs is his power and strength achieved by transcendence. And such a trifle as the right to the throne was not something he would have given away. That's exactly what the boy thought. One day, a noble banquet began, gathering all the aristocrats of the kingdom. One of the people began to introduce the eldest son of the royal family who had entered the hall. It was, of course, the first prince, at whose mention the gaze of the aristocrats changed. It was at this banquet that the protagonist's thinking about the throne changed. Having descended to the people, the main character began to hear praise from all sides. Using the appraisal skill, the protagonist saw the snake heart trait in everyone present. This is the mark of evil karma accumulated by those who robbed others, took away and ruined other people's lives. But still, among such rabble, there were a couple of good aristocrats. Having noticed Taylor, His Majesty, without paying attention to anyone, greeted him. The shy, red-haired man thanked the young gentleman for the invitation. Looking at the red-haired man, the main character thought that although he was not a super specialist, at least he was not corrupt. Suddenly, the knight standing at the entrance turned to the attention of everyone present, and all because a noble man arrived, a marquis named Montpellier Bourgogne. Hearing this, the main character, surprised, quickly turned his gaze back. When the marquis entered, all the aristocrats gathered in the hall bowed their heads in gratitude. It turned out to be the ambassador of the Burgundy Empire, Quillon de Burgundy Montpellier. Having come down, the fat man, looking at the first prince, noticed how he had not seen him for a long time. And at that very moment, Gruhorn remembered who had that last name. In the past, Burgoyne was a sworn enemy, with whom he and the hero fought side by side 400 years ago. The bearer of this name, which has left countless scars on the body of this country. Suddenly, the blonde was brought out of these memories by a falling man with a glass of wine. In just a moment, the blue-eyed man was completely drenched in the contents of the glass. The old man, standing in front of the young gentleman, began to justify himself by saying that he was in a hurry to greet him, after which the aristocrat asked His Majesty for forgiveness. At this time, the ambassador of the Burgundy Empire, Quillon de Burgundy Montpellier, looked thoughtfully at the boy. Turning around, Indrian headed towards the exit, intending to change his clothes. Then he asked Carl, who had arrived, who the man was who had poured water on him. The knight said that this was a marquis belonging to the Bielefeld family. Noting how not everyone in this room was rotten, Gruhorn was even glad of the sharp cooling of his mind. When the boy was left alone, Baal Valorhard entered his room. He told how the Marquis of Bielefeld said that the prince looked like he was going to give him a thrashing. And it looks like he wasn't so wrong, the man concluded, seeing Indrian's face. In response, the blonde noted how he was not such a reckless person. He simply could not understand why the nobles showed more sincere respect to the vicious House of Burgundy, which boasted of its power in the heart of the kingdom, than to the royal family. The atmosphere was too tense to call it peace, and the attitude too one-sided to call it an alliance. The main character could not understand how the country had reached such a state. In response, Baal looked down and shared that there was a whole story behind it. In the past, the kingdom steadfastly repelled numerous invasions by the empire. However, as time passed, the empire grew and the gap between them widened. In the face of an empire that had become a superpower, the kingdom had no choice but to bend its knees. Then the boy's head was pierced by the thought of why this happened. Despite being a small country on the outskirts of the continent, the kingdom had something that allowed it to stand up to the empire. Since the nation's founding, achievements such as battle anthems have been accumulated flawlessly. And yet, in the end, the kingdom was all lost, Gruhorn realized. With this thought, the protagonist turned to his uncle and told him how he had changed his mind. Not understanding what he was talking about, the dark-haired nephew asked him. In response, Indrian stated that he would try to take the royal throne. Hearing these words, the man with the scar could not hide his surprise. The blonde himself thought how he might regret this decision, but he would still try. After all, in the past, Gruhorn built half of this country with his own hands. On the second day of the banquet, the same aristocrats greeted the first prince and the Count of the North. When His Majesty turned his gaze to the people, they only looked in different directions, afraid of something. Watching this picture, I was amazed that the aristocrats had forgotten about etiquette. In the past, when Gruhorn's friends stood before the people, no one could have guessed that he would become king, because the future king was an ordinary village boy who escaped from the wilderness. Even among those who had been deprived of everything and exiled, he was not particularly honest. And yet the boy came out to meet the people despite everything. Appearing before them, the blonde showed his strength and power. How the main character now appears before the aristocrats who do not believe in him. Using the heart of mana, Indrian began to cover the entire banquet hall with his power. Next, a system window appeared with the activation of the king's anthem. However, due to the severity of this ability, only a quarter was used. Feeling intense pain, the prince noted how tolerable it was compared to the Dragon Slayer's hymn. Because this is a hymn of only hero rank, not mythical. However, there is no anthem more suitable for the current situation than this one. After which, those aristocrats who had recently forgotten about etiquette now bowed their heads. Rejoicing at his successful deed, Indrian wanted to tell people to raise their heads. But then the main character felt an alien force in the banquet hall. Taking off her hood, the white-haired elf shared her surprise. She couldn't believe that there was still someone left who remembered the forgotten hymns. Gruhorn himself, having examined the girl's face, immediately understood who she was. With this thought, the boy wondered what this crazy woman was doing here. A beautiful creation of God, a benevolent race that would not harm even a bug. Forest gardeners, creatures that live from 300 to 1,000 years, which people call elves. But all these are just pathetic tales. In reality, they are cruel predators who use beauty as bait for their victims. High elves are those who are born with the gift of the hero. They are the most dangerous of all. And a representative of this merciless race is standing right in front of the first prince. The white-haired one was an elder of the elves who lived for at least 1,000 years. The dancing man swordsman, Sigrun. In the past, the white-haired girl wanted to get Gruhorn after the death of its owner. Receiving refusals, Sigrun only wanted to take this blade for herself even more. Remembering the past, the blonde noted how now the girl does not understand who is standing in front of her. Following these thoughts, the girl asked the prince if they had met before. Denying this, the protagonist shared that he had never met elves before. Sigrun, looking at the blonde man's face, declared that he was lying. She also told how people react in two ways when they first meet an elf. They charm ordinary men with their beauty, as is the case now. And others are those who have a developed sense of smell, which is why they are very wary. As for His Majesty, he still doesn't reach one of the reactions. The blue-eyed man himself responded by saying that he has his own standards of beauty. Hearing these words, the white-haired girl only looked at the man with contempt. Putting on her hood, Sergen decided to say goodbye, sharing the joy of meeting. The main character was only glad that the merciless woman of his past was gone. After some time, the search for a bride for the first prince began. The first candidate turned out to be a child. Seeing the next one, the main character noticed how much she was afraid of him. Another girl looked like she had come to fight against the prince. Thus, the queen and her son let all the candidates through. Unable to bear it, the woman decided to remind him that the bride should be healthy, beautiful, and from an influential family. Suddenly, a servant standing nearby told how a delegation of elves was requesting an audience. The white-haired elf who appeared bowed her head and introduced herself as Sigrun of Viscum. The woman, upon seeing such guests, noted how long it had been since they had visited the kingdom. The girl then asked if the first prince was really looking for a bride. Having received a positive answer, Sergen explained how she was a high elf from a noble family. At this time, Gruhorn was thinking about how he didn't like where this conversation was going. Returning to the white-haired girl, she told about the small age difference with the prince. Beaming in public, Sergen began to praise her race in the role of an ideal wife. Having been treated by Indrian himself, she shared how she felt when she saw him. She felt that they were destined to be together, which made the boy wary. And all because elves do not lie about their own fate when they talk about it. The queen was amazed by such confidence on the part of the white-haired girl. The people nearby also began to whisper about how seriously the elves took their fate. Then the main character unexpectedly grabbed Sigrun by the hand. Seeing the happy girl behind him, the boy decided to step away for a few words with her. The aristocrats who observed this scene were surprised by the debauchery in broad daylight. Thus the two were left alone, locked in the nearest room. When the boy asked, the elf said that she had come here to strengthen ties with the kingdom. But after this, Indrian, calling the white-haired woman an elf elder, asked again why she had arrived. Then he began to name all the girl's titles, such as the executioner, who had been killing for hundreds of years for the sake of his family, and the sword of Viscum. He assumed that the girl was here on reconnaissance or on some kind of mission. In response, trying to stop her laughter, Sergen asked the prince how he knew about her. It was then that the main character realized that the girl was a monster, whose strength he could not even estimate. And since the blonde sensed fate, it means there is immeasurable strength there, and she sees the past burned into Gruhorn's soul. The girl, noting the prince's knowledge, said that it would be stupid to remain silent in her presence, to which the main character replied that he understood everything perfectly. "It's as stupid as chatting with a girl," said the first prince, after which the blonde asked the girl to stop recklessly interfering in his fate. The main character himself mentally understood how Sergen was a little interesting, but if he does nothing, he will see his heart on the floor, which means he needs to increase his interest. Having dispelled her brutal aura, the girl, becoming very interested, asked the boy who he was. She called the blonde a genius, hated by his father, but still wanted to know more. In response, Indrian told the white-haired girl to wait, because she would be able to find out everything herself. Feeling a strange feeling, the elf shared how she no longer understood why she was sent here to carry out a mission. But at the same moment, looking at the prince, Sigrun concluded that it was for his sake. Feeling her gaze on him, the fair-haired Gruhorn noted that she gave him goosebumps every time, and after some time, the couple returned to the room holding hands. Appearing before his mother, the first prince told her how he had news for her. Forcing a smile, Indrian announced that he and Sigrunia were getting engaged. He himself could not believe that the day would come when he would call the name of that elf with such tenderness. The boy does all this for one reason only, to maintain interest in himself. The main character then turned to his mother and shared how he wanted to take a break to think about the future. In response, the queen called her son's words reasonable while he was thinking about it, about how Sergen will wait until he is finally ready for marriage. The main character will have to become stronger in order to escape and save himself from the elf. After some time, somewhere in the middle of the third prince's room, a cup was broken. Jillian couldn't contain his anger when he thought about his brother Indrian. After all, not long ago, Uncle suddenly announced that he supported the first prince and then obtained the main flower of the Iron Lions. And now he managed to get his hands on the elf, at the sight of whom Jillian was very envious. With these thoughts, the third prince remembered the approaching duel. He intended to crush Indrian, anticipating the look on his face after losing. Thus, after a few days, the desired duel took place. Yawning, the protagonist could not understand why so much chatter was needed for the sake of a couple of sword swings. Jillian himself asked if his brother liked the crowd of spectators that had been brought in. In response, the blonde shared how he noticed one thing: the kid talks too much. Angered by these words, the third prince wished for his opponent's quick defeat. And at that very moment, Jillian seemed to have broken free from his chain and headed towards his opponent. The boy told how he initially wanted to play with his opponent. "But lately there's so much to do that there's no time to waste," Gruhorn said, delivering one precise blow. The spectators gathered nearby were amazed at how quickly the fight ended. The knight was also, to put it mildly, surprised by the swift strength of the protagonist. Thus, the duel between the first and third prince ended in Indrian's favor. The knight who was awarded the role of chief judge announced the rightful winner. The assembled crowd only now began to realize that the blonde had won. Having gone about his business, the protagonist was displeased that the nobles had come running to watch a children's fight. At this time, the audience began to discuss Jillian, who showed promise as a knight. When the third prince woke up, the first thing he did was insult the main character. Following this, he ordered the maids to prepare his equipment. He intended to take revenge. A voice suddenly appeared and addressed His Highness, trying to tell him something. Namely, that the first prince left the capital with Count Wallerhard immediately after the duel. There was a rumor going around among people about how the boy headed to the north, where the Wallerhards live. Watching his nephew, Bale noted how well he had become able to sit in the saddle. Following this, the man with the scar asked the prince why he was in such a hurry, since the banquet had just ended. In response to this, the main character stated that there was no place for him in the capital. He had no intention of pitifully clinging to those who did not recognize the master of their country, currying favor with the imperialists. Then the blonde asked if soldiers weren't more suitable for him than nobles. Because if you endure all kinds of hardships with someone, attachment will appear where there was none. Bale himself shared how he can't shake the feeling that the prince is acting too recklessly. The main character thought that if he hesitated, he would really have to marry Sergun. And in the past, everyone she was interested in ended badly, which means he needs to gain strength. Not being in the peaceful capital, he intended to hone his techniques, to accelerate one's own growth in spite of everything that lies ahead, desiring to achieve freedom. And for all this, the first prince decided to move to a place where people are tested for strength. The place where the most formidable battle hymns, possessing enormous power, were born. This place was the most ordinary battlefield, taking lives. Pointing to the valleys, Bale explained that they were called the Blade Mountains, the border that his family protected. Then the dark-haired man noticed the main character's trembling and invited him to get into the carriage, to which the boy replied that this way he would get used to the biting cold faster. Suddenly, the familiar voice of the teacher was heard from the carriage, identifying himself as a problem. But he still decided to take advantage of the chance to see the north and write his book. Returning to the main character, he noticed his knight walking next to him. It was Arwen, whose face showed the weight of the journey she had taken. Then Indrian, emphasizing his ally's red cheeks, asked if he was okay. The girl responded by saying that she was fine, and that as a knight she was not supposed to seek her own comfort. Hearing this answer, the protagonist thought how good it was to have at least someone full of enthusiasm. But on the other hand, there were sour faces because they were dragged here by order. If Carl were here, it would have been better. Returning to the past, the royal voice reminded how the knights of the royal order are not the prince's personal servants. In addition, the king doubted that Indrian had truly accepted them as knights. And in the end, the grandfather on the throne was too greedy to let Carl go with the main character. Noting the king's excessive attitude, Gruhorn recalled the unknown atrocities of the body's previous owner. By this time, a snowstorm had begun, and at the sight of it, Bale suggested speeding up. After all, if they don't hurry, we'll get stuck in the snow that's piled up under our feet. Yet, the snowfall turned into a blizzard in an instant, and a heavy march began when even the voice of the person walking next to you could not be heard. Using the chain, the dark-haired man ordered them to leave the carriages and go on foot. The main character himself was amazed at how his uncle used mana. Without wasting any time, the blonde turned to Adelia, who was sitting inside the carriage. Embarrassed, the girl took the prince's hand and thanked him for his help. Adelia ran up and asked the young gentleman if he was okay. At this time, the knights nearby were amazed by the worsening conditions of the route. Seeing this picture, the main character immediately ordered the dark-haired girl to look after Adelia. The boy who arrived in time called the knights fools and ordered them to drop their shields. After all, With such an armored door, they will get tired after 100 meters. With these words, Indrian ordered to throw away everything unnecessary except the swords. The Knights of Valorhard walking nearby were amazed that the prince had experience in crossing mountainous terrain. Continuing on our way, every step in the snowstorm was incredibly difficult. The main character and his allies were already very tired, but they did not give up. Suddenly, the main character noticed something behind his back. Running up to the knights, the first prince began to push them, ordering them to move forward. Indrian himself, to the surprise of those present, took upon himself the knight who had fallen without strength. Noticing how his people had stopped again, the boy decided to remind them what to do. And fortunately, the blizzard couldn't last forever, which everyone was only glad about. After some time, the exhausted knight whom the prince was carrying found himself on the ground. By this time, the sky had cleared up, as if there had never been a storm. At this time, Baal Valorhard headed towards the huge gates of the castle. Turning to the prince, he greeted his majesty as the commander of the 3rd Legion of the kingdom, at the sight of which, an unprecedented admiration appeared on the face of the main character. Then the dark-haired man added, looking at Indrian, "Welcome, nephew. Winter Castle, a fortress on the kingdom's northernmost border, a citadel built to keep monsters at bay. The royal knights spoke of this place as a darkness to which only a fool would return. At one time, the nobles argue about the political weight of the Winter Castle in the kingdom. But for those who were born and raised in this place, everything looks different. Defending this fortress is a great pride and duty to the Valorhard family." Turning to Vincent, the uncle told him that he was resuming his duties as commander. The young man then shared how glad he was that his father had returned safe and sound. A voice suddenly appeared and addressed Baal, noting that he did not know that he had a son. Noticing the dark-haired Indrian's face, he noted how similar he was to his father in his gloominess. Then the man with the scar introduced his majesty to his own son. The young man bowed and introduced himself as Vincent from the House of Valorhard. The main character himself also shared with the person opposite how happy he was. At one time, the dark-haired man thought that the Winter Castle was only for true warriors. This is no place for a scoundrel expelled from the capital for drunkenness and debauchery. Looking at the first prince, Vincent wondered why his father had brought him. With this thought, the young man turned to Baal and asked what was going on. He decided to remind them how he became the patron of the first prince, which is why Indrian will remain with them for now. Hearing such sudden news, he noted how his father had previously disowned his nephew. Fixing his gaze on the protagonist, the man stated that people can change. The dark-haired man turned to his son and decided to ask him for one thing, so that Vincent could look at the first prince without any prejudice. After some time, finding himself inside the castle, Baal inquired about clearing out the monster tribes. The young man said that they had already taken up the matter, but with the arrival of his father, they planned to take it more seriously. At this time, the main character was eating and eavesdropping on the Valorhard's conversations. The main problem for the Winter Castle at the moment were the orcs. A group of less than 20 heads settled at the foot of the mountain, and arrows alone would not be enough to deal with such a crowd. Therefore, a selection of knights is now underway for the garrison against monsters. Unexpectedly, the main character joined the conversation, reaching for the figurine. The first prince declared to all present that he would deal with the orcs himself. At one time, the people standing nearby decided to remind them that the orcs of the Bladed Mountains were unusual. Then the dark-haired man asked Vincent how many individuals lived at the foot in his opinion. He also told how they had already counted a group of 20 orcs, consisting of warriors and shamans. The man with the scar received this information and asked Indrian if he was confident in himself. Understanding what was going on, Vincent shouted at his father, trying to stop him. The main character just smiled and thought about how the boy opposite needed to shut up. Ignoring the dark-haired man next to him, Baal asked Indrian the next question, what he needed. The blonde responded by asking for 3 guides and equipment for his people. Vincent, standing nearby, could not believe that some scoundrel would be able to complete the task. When the main character found himself with his equipped knights, he ordered them to advance. Hearing the question, Gruhorn told how they received the task of destroying the orcs. A mustachioed man from the crowd once reminded them that their task was to protect the prince, to which the boy emphasized how people would still have to follow him on his mission, for his own safety. Heading down the corridor, the first prince asked to be reported when the knights received their equipment. Gruhorn himself thought about how these people should help him for the sake of the royal decree. Using his appraisal ability, the boy noticed how all the knights had good skills. But among this crowd, there was one red-haired man named Joseph with a talent for interrogation and disguise. When the time came to set off, it turned out that Vincent would be the guide. He told how if they failed the task, the consequences would be serious. The main character, in response, emphasized how the boy opposite was very afraid. Trying to use the appraisal skill failed for Gruhorn, which means he has at least 3 chains. And behind the dark-haired one, there is only 1 ranger. The remaining knights, disguised as rangers, will intervene if things get tough. The boy himself was not at all disappointed by these facts, but on the contrary, they made him laugh. Seeing Adelia trembling, the young master told her how she would not take part in the task. Thus, the main character and his people set out. Vincent kept going on and on about how the Blade Mountains were a dangerous place. Suddenly, a snow-white hare darted past the main character, afraid of something. The guide standing nearby became wary because this small event meant one thing. Nearby is the very group of orcs they are hunting. Using gestures to describe what he saw, the guide asked Indrian what the plan was. By raising his hand, the main character ordered the people standing behind him to get ready. At this point, the green thug noticed a crowd of people quietly approaching. Gruhorn himself mentally noted how long it had been since he had seen these scum. At the same moment, a hail of crossbow arrows was released onto the crowd of monsters. Then a heavy tread began to shake the earth as it approached the people. Hearing the roar filled with killing intent, the boy rushed to attack. With just one precise swing, one of the orcs was defeated. The sticky smell of blood began to dissipate in the cold air, making Gruhorn very bored. Looking at his opponents, the boy noted how long he had longed to feel the air of the battlefield. Seeing how the young gentleman was about to rush forward, she shouted at him not to make mistakes. In response, the first prince ordered his people not to interfere. After all, if you stumble, the merciless battlefield will draw you in and not let you go back. More than 400 years ago, when the orcs were not monsters, but the proud rulers of the continent, a song was born of a miserable man who left no name in history. A man whose hatred for the orcs burned brighter than the sun in a clear sky. The funeral song of a father whose strength was exhausted in endless battles with monsters. It was the fleeting song of an extraordinary avenger of the entire orc race. At that moment, a system window appeared in front of the main character with the activation of the Poem of Revenge. Back in time, a small bag filled with gold was thrown onto the table. The man told his red-haired acquaintance how he would not have to fight in the Winter Castle. In addition, he was sure that the first prince would probably lock himself within 4 walls. It's not this scoundrel that's important, but Valorhard, the red-haired one, was supposed to monitor everything that was happening in the castle and report. Then the same man asked the person opposite if he could handle the task. In response, the red-haired man asked the Count of the royal court not to worry about the execution. Now he remembered his own words when faced with danger. A menacing orc appeared before the knights with the intention of beating the humans with his club. Standing behind, Arvin ordered the front row to hold formation and move forward. The next moment, right in front of the red-haired man, the allies' shield was bent. Watching this picture, he wondered what he should do. But we didn't have to wait long because the dark-haired girl ordered an attack. To the knight's surprise, his weapon seemed to have been caught by someone. It was an orc who wasn't very happy about the damage he received to his arm. While the red-haired man was thinking about how to survive, a flash appeared behind him. It was Arvin, and in an instant the girl managed to get to the monster and take its life. Standing before the redhead, she reminded him that on the battlefield he must not let go of his own weapon. In response, the frightened knight accepted his mistake and thanked his savior. Remembering the location, people put on the ready in front of a crowd of orcs. Holding the blade in front of her, the dark-haired woman ordered the knights to attack. She herself thought how they couldn't retreat in front of such a large number of opponents. Arvin was immediately brought out of these thoughts by the unexpected appearance of a blood-colored aura. A moment later, a bloody blade appeared from the chest of a huge orc. The owner of this sword was the main character, immersed in the battle with all his mind. Having finished with one monster, energy began to ooze from the blonde's body. Seeing the boy worried about the state of his majesty, the people called out to him. But Indrian didn't even hear these words, but only rushed further forward. At this time, memories from the past began to appear in Gruhorn's head. He came to the conclusion that no matter how much he killed, it was still not enough for him. The hero from the past desired the enemy's blood even more, which is why he wandered through the wastelands where the orcs ruled. At the sight of the approaching club, the warrior jumped up and raised his blade to strike. And in a miserable moment, the formidable enemy was defeated with one precise blow. Fighting non-stop, the mana in the hero's heart has long since dried up due to bloodthirsty use. But But the warrior did not stop, his body radiating blood-colored energy. With each battle, he became more and more powerful, going beyond his own limits. But in the end, human old age proved stronger than the will of this warrior. Because of this, the once strong hero began to become weaker with each battle. Only the demonic blade in his hand could keep his body alive. Burning up the remnants of his strength, the swordsman wanted to achieve one thing. His desire was revenge. He wanted to kill all the monsters in his path. It was a requiem for his beloved wife and little daughter, whose lives were taken by monsters. This man's entire life was dedicated to murder, leaving a bloody trail of monsters behind him. And yet, after some time, the warrior managed to meet his sworn enemy. But the man who had seen many battles by this time had turned into a walking dead man. When the white-haired man appeared before the monster, the latter immediately rushed to attack. In a few moments, the hero managed to find himself at the level of the monster's head. Suddenly, the hand of a huge orc appeared and turned out to be faster than the actions of a man. The monster, not sparing its enemy, pressed him into the ground with all its weight. And in the end, no desired miracle happened. The white-haired warrior who had won many battles against the orcs was defeated. However, this man did not give up until the very end of his life, which had absorbed a lot of blood. It was then that a story was born that no one was ever able to hear. This was a legend that did not penetrate into the world of people, but there was still one person who knew about it. It was the main character, who only by this time had come to his senses from his own memories. When the first prince woke up, the entire surrounding area was covered with the bodies of defeated orcs. On the other side of the battle, Indrian's people were still trying to fight off the monsters. The main character, realizing his old memories, began to understand. The power that the main character used was the unfinished Hymn of Vengeance. And then Gruhorn decided to finish it, rushing to exterminate the orcs. Cutting his way through, Indrian met an orc in front of him whose belly was pierced through. At the same time, a system window appeared with the addition of a new stanza in the Hymn of Vengeance. A mountain of green corpses grows upward, and beneath it a scarlet lake spreads. And standing before him, he honors their souls, concluded the protagonist, reading a new stanza. Thus, the Hymn of Vengeance was recreated as the Hymn of Requiem. At this time, after the end of the battle, Indrian noticed how the dark-haired man raised the banner. A second later, Vincent broke the orc's banner, thereby declaring the monster's defeat. The dark-haired man, raising a broken stick with a red cloth, declared victory. The allies standing nearby shared this joy with Vincent. The main character himself did not stop watching the dark-haired man, thinking about his name, Vincent, the heir of a family who dedicated his entire life to the war against monsters. At the same time, he bears the same name as the unfortunate avenger who, in the distant past, gave his life dreaming of exterminating the orcs. Finally, the warrior declared that even in the next life he would continue his revenge. Then Indrian saw a dark-haired man with a displeased expression in front of him. Noticing his ally's expression, he asked what Vincent wanted. Then, bowing his head, the warrior extended the banner, asking His Majesty to accept it as a gift. After all, the warrior who fought the bravest gets the right to take the enemy's banner. This is the priceless symbol of courage that amazed the boy. In addition, Vincent and the other knights simply wanted to present the banner to His Majesty. Then Arven arrived and turned to her young master. She shared how she admired the prince's bravery, which she saw in battle. Then all the people who took part in the battle with the orcs bowed their heads before His Majesty, after which the main character, raising the banner, declared victory over the orcs. After these words, the allies flared up and began to shout the name of His Majesty. And then they also warmly welcomed the first prince to the Winter Castle. Victory, honor, glory, all of this was now in the hands of the main character. Ignoring Vincent, the boy continued to boast. Suddenly, the first prince heard the number 16 spoken. It was the dark-haired one who shared how he managed to get the banner 16 times. The warriors standing nearby noticed how their commander was bragging again. In response, the main character, to Vincent's surprise, continued to rejoice in her victory. Then, from the dark-haired man's face, one could understand how much he didn't like it. After some time, a red flame appeared in the middle of the snowy valley. Turning to Indrian, the younger Valorhard explained how, despite fighting an elite squad of orcs, their losses were minimal. But still, Arven shared how much she didn't like it all, to which Vincent stated that victory would be the best gift for the dead, because their family usually commemorates their dead comrades with the blood of orcs. Hearing and seeing Vincent, the protagonist is once again surprised by his resemblance to the Avenger. Gruhorn even had the thought that the younger Valorhard was the reincarnation of a warrior from legend. After which Indrian asked whether the Third Legion always sent so many men. The dark-haired man noted the coincidence, because there was a squad of rangers nearby who decided to agree to help. The main character himself assumed that they didn't trust him and decided to play it safe. But then the words of the younger Valorhard brought the protagonist out of these thoughts. Tom was curious as to why the orc squad needed this surprise raid, and why didn't any of the ranger squad spot them? With these words, Vincent suggested returning to the castle. After some time, Bale, who had come out of the fortress, noted how well the warriors had tried. Tom was happy to greet the returning people of the Winter Castle. Without thinking twice, Indrian rushed forward, talking about receiving the orc banner. Seeing this, the rest of the castle's warriors began to congratulate His Majesty. At this time, the blonde knights had already counted the prince's boasting for the 11th time. Vincent told his father about the strange things that happened in the mountains. He also suggested that perhaps the orcs were tracking the victim, but this was still a bad sign. After listening to his son, Bale suggested that the returning warriors rest. Then the main character noticed Vincent's strange look at him. He turned to His Majesty and once again thanked him for his help. The boy once emphasized how the younger Valorhard looked down on him. Arvin, who was standing nearby, said that this is just the kind of person he is, and his opinion is not so easy to change. Suddenly, the fair-haired man heard a female voice calling out to him. It was Adelia, very happy about the return of the main character. Running up to the prince, she shared how afraid she was that something might happen to him. In response to these words, the first prince asked his knight if he knew what the object in his hand was. Once in his room, Indrian was told that in a few days another squad of rangers would be sent out on patrol. Vincent added how they don't know what to expect in the mountains, which is why they choose the best warriors. And that means His Majesty shouldn't go with them, the dark-haired man concluded. Indrian asked Vincent, who came to his room to tell him just about this. In his mind, the blonde assumed that his uncle wanted them to become friends. Understanding this, the protagonist told the dark-haired man to go because he needed to rest. Left alone, Gruhorn looked at the orc banner he had received on the table. Recalling recent events, he noted how he found himself in the thick of battle and was able to perform the battle hymn perfectly. The boy understood how he would go through the same thing over and over again. Yet none of the battle hymns were actually created by Gruhorn. But even with so much knowledge, he emphasized how the time had come to create a personal one. It is then that the hymn of desired vengeance will turn into a funeral hymn. A sudden sound behind the blonde man brought him out of his thoughts. Surprised by such suddenness, the main character quickly turned his head. There he saw a bird on the windowsill beating its beak against the glass. At that very moment, the blue-eyed man realized that this was no ordinary bird. And then the creature in white plumage began to scream furiously, looking at Indrian. A few moments later, this bird appeared on the table in front of the main character. Looking at it, he noted that it was clear that it did not appear there on its own. And at the same moment, the bird asked the boy if he liked her gift. Understanding that Sergun, the main character, was more impressed by some gift. After which, realizing it, he asked his interlocutor if the group of orcs had really appeared because of her. The girl replied that she only wanted His Highness to fight worthy opponents. And she hopes that he appreciated her concern, concluded the white-haired woman on the other side. Gruhorn himself was unhappy with these words, because several trackers died because of the long-eared one. All elves are such perverts. She must have had a lot of fun watching the battle, Indrian suggested. Sergun also noted how impressive it was to see the anthem directed at the entire orc clan. Hearing these words, the boy thought about what the elves call goodwill. Not intending to clownish around for long, the first prince asked his interlocutor to get down to business. Sigrun said that she would wait impatiently for the day when His Majesty would open his heart. Once on the boy's shoulder, the bird told him how deep in the mountains there was something the prince needed. There slumbers a very ancient creature, and if you use its story as text, you'll get an excellent hymn. Hearing this, the protagonist began to think about getting a new anthem. Sergun shared that unfortunately the bird has little time left, and when the girl said goodbye, the skinny carcass of the bird exploded right on Indrian's shoulder. Finding himself near the blood, the fair-haired man noted how the long-eared one decided to annoy him as much as possible. Finding himself in deep thought, the protagonist understood perfectly well what Sergun wanted from him. After all, the elves are able to hear and repeat the hymns, but they will never become their true voice, those who embody the meaning. They weave other people's hymns into their melodies and sing in the dance of swords, and most likely Surgun needs a new hymn for the boy. But even realizing all this, the first prince decided to play along this time. The next day, on the walls of the fortress, the warriors discussed the depths of the mountains. Vincent shared how no one had ever returned from the very depths of the snowy distance. When the blonde asked if this was true, the dark-haired man added that people returned only in parts, and their task is to contain the monsters descending from the mountains, not to explore them. In the past, because of the knights who scoured the world to achieve transcendence, there are almost no unexplored places or secrets left in the world, but here there is a kind of forbidden zone. Thinking about this, Gruhorn came to the conclusion that coming here had been a good decision in many ways. Suddenly, the dark-haired man standing nearby decided to say something to the prince just in case. It was he who asked the blonde not to think about going deep into the mountains. In response, the main character agreed, asking the younger Valorhard to calm down. The first prince himself thought that everything would be fine with him. As the boy wiped his blade, he wondered what was inside these mountains. He wanted more and more to rush there right now, but he understood that the time had not yet come, because he needs more victories and more experience, and in the castle all this can be achieved. At that very moment, to the surprise of everyone present, the man on the wall blew his horn. Having dug in, the warriors began to prepare for the upcoming battle in the fortress. Finding himself on the castle wall, the protagonist saw people preparing under the command of Bale. Without wasting any time, the protagonist asked his uncle what was going on. The dark-haired man responded by telling his nephew to look at the snowy mountains. When the first prince looked there, he saw several people shouting about danger. In addition, the warriors were scared to death of something, which only increased their speed. Seeing this whole picture with the trackers, Gruhorn asked himself another question. What are they running from? The warriors standing on the walls of the fortress began to shout to their allies to hurry. And all because wolf riders appeared behind this trio. The rangers, without losing their pace, were getting closer and closer to the gates of the fortress. But because of the short range of the bows, the people were unable to be saved. Watching this picture, Indrian noticed something strange. But Bale said that the orcs were just playing. Suddenly, one of the three trackers stopped, to everyone's surprise. He understood that at this rate they would all be killed in a matter of mere moments. And then, with tears in his eyes, the warrior decided to take a desperate step. He wanted to stop the orcs. Holding his blade in front of him, the warrior, calling himself the Ranger of the Great Valorhard, ordered the monsters to attack. The people standing on the fortress wall began to scream frantically, asking their ally to run to them. But in the end, in a mere moment, this tracker was caught by the wolf. Seeing how their captain was seriously wounded, the warriors decided to rush to help. And a moment later, under the pressure of the monster's heavy paw, the second ranger was also defeated. And on the other side, a huge orc axe was thrown at the third warrior. Seeing this whole picture, the dark-haired man allowed the soldiers who were not part of the guard to go down, from which fear began to appear on the warriors' faces due to what they saw as the instant killing of the three rangers. Bale told his nephew, thirsty for answers, that if he had sent an army, they would have been eaten just as quickly. Common sense doesn't work in monster fights, concluded Bale Wallerhard. Vincent joined in, adding that the monsters don't care about the damage done to their allies. They're only interested in carnage. And because winter has only just begun, they cannot act rashly. After which, one of the warriors noticed that the horsemen were approaching again. At one time, the orcs, along with their wolves, grabbed the bodies of the rangers. Taking up the telescope, the man was amazed and delighted by what he saw. He saw that his ally was still moving, which meant that he was alive. Noting the strangeness in the monster's characters, Bale suggested that this winter would be unusual. The main character himself realized how the elf had a hand in this event. And then, among the wolf riders, an orc with a distinctive appearance appeared, at the sight of which, Gruhorn immediately felt the radiating aura of this monster. The next moment, the orc with the banner began to make strange sounds, hearing which, Vincent assumed that he was going to carry out an execution or something similar. Putting his hand on the dark-haired Indrian's shoulder, he explained that this was not so. Coming closer to the edge of the walls, the first prince added that the monsters were not trying to carry out an execution. They challenged people to a duel, the protagonist declared in front of the Valorhards. Indrian himself began to realize what kind of dormant creature Surgun was talking about. This huge orc wanted to fight the humans for honor and courage. He wanted to restore the good name of his legion for the great orc king.